No? Okay. Then I will turn it over to the moderator. EconoBoi is the challenger in this debate.
All right, cool. Yes, I will be moderating the debate today. I don't have the ability to mute anybody. So if I do try to jump in, please just try to stop as soon as I jump in. For the most part, I won't be jumping in much, and we'll let you guys control the whole thing unless you get stuck
And we
somewhere.
will be taking care of giving you the tools to do that shortly.
Okay.
Sorry. Go ahead.
And then yeah, unless you guys are stuck or like, looping, I'll try to jump in to kind of fix that. Or um if there's a piece that I think's missing that would actually help the conversation move along. Outside of that, if you guys interrupt each other, I think most of the time debates need interruptions. So as long as you don't care, I'm not going to care. But if you say something, then I'll make sure to jump in. Unless it's like a blatant interruption, I'm just gonna leave it alone. But outside of that, we can go ahead and move on to opening statements. So, EconoBoi, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I can go first, but Andrew's already started out this debate with a blatant lie. Okay, I wasn't the challenger. I was approached by Mr. Fascist here to talk about trans issues, just to be clear. But of course, I'll acquiesce. I'll go first with my opening statement, and I'll start the time now.
I can go first if it makes you feel better. Usually when you think about the challenger, it's the person who is refuting the position. But if you think I'm
It's
refuting
fine.
your position, it's fine as well.
No, it's not a big deal.
Okay.
All right. Is the timer? Are we starting the time?
Yeah, 7 minutes.
Okay, let's do it. Well, to begin, hey everyone, my name's EconoBoi. Like I said, I normally do economics on my YouTube channel, but today we're going to be talking about trans issues. Andrew mentioned to me that he was incredibly scared to debate me and that he decided to have this discussion on an obscure platform so as to minimize the diminishment of his brand post-debate, which of course is understandable. So in general, to begin, I want to lay out some basic premises on sort of the trans issues and trans rights in general, which is sort of the generic form of this debate, can go many different directions. So the first premise I would say is that I would say that gender is a social construct, of course. The second premise is that to the extent that one's genitals actually serve a purpose, that's how they ought to be categorized. The third is that we ought to respect how someone self identifies. And four, it's ultimately necessary to mostly rely on an individual's self identification in most every circumstance. So, to expand on the first premise that gender is a social construct, it's important to point out that something being a social construct doesn't mean that it's meaningless. Take what we call a mountain lion. The category of mountain lion is somewhat socially constructed, right? What exactly pinpoints objectively in the universe what is a mountain lion? Probably nothing really, right? But the scientific category of mountain lion proves relatively useful to scientific ends, and as well in this case, a social context as well. What a mountain lion is. Thematic of this debate, of course, a social category of a woman and a man clearly mean a lot to many trans people who feel anguish regarding their gender identity as it relates to their sex assignment at birth, and of course, the way that they want to be seen in society. So something being a social construct doesn't necessarily mean it's meaningless, and it doesn't mean it doesn't, provide sort of utility in general. Those categories. It's just a matter of categorization in general that I think is relatively important, although also equally important is recognizing how the fact that it is a social construct, what it means to be a man or a woman in general, and the fact that non-binary people are probably valid is maybe a valuable add-on. The second premise establishes the idea that the distinction between people with penises and vaginas is not entirely irrelevant. Obviously, an individual with a vagina and an individual with a penis at points in their lives face certain struggles, both medically and personally, that tie specifically to their having a penis or a vagina. And to the extent that this distinction actually matters, of course, it should be recognized. This is not a controversial statement in the scientific nor in the trans community, to be clear. The third and fourth premises kind of go together, that it's not only important that we respect how an individual self identifies, but also that this respect is necessary in most social interactions. For instance, Andrew often says that the best, most objective way, and I don't know if maybe he's had a change of heart, go down a different path in this debate, but the best way typically under the sort of debates I was able to view from Andrew is that the best way to distinguish between a man and a woman is that, one produces small gametes, men, and one produces large gametes, women, which is to say that men produce sperm and women produce eggs. However, let's say that I walk into a restaurant with a group of friends and a friend of mine brings a +1. This +1 I don't know. Let's say it's also 2038 and God President Joe Biden has implemented a policy to give everyone who misgenders another person the death penalty. Of course, this is the ultimate goal of the liberal movement. And I ask this new person what their pronouns are. They say that their pronouns are she, her. Now, I have no way to confirm this in the moment or essentially at any moment in our experience together. That what she is saying is ultimately true, that she is, a person that identifies as she, her, that she is a woman. Now, ultimately, I have to rely on her self-identification, similar to say, if they're white or if they're Christian or if they go by a nickname. Ultimately, a religion, a race, a name. These things are all social constructs. However, in many contexts, these categories are useful, and for each of them, we necessarily rely and generally trust an individual's self-identification until we're given some evidence that we shouldn't trust an individual's self-identification. To use a personal example, my wife, for instance, to this day, after meeting, dating, getting married, and of course remaining married, never have I felt the need to march her down to the clinic and obtain a medical test showing that she is in fact a woman insofar as she's able to produce large gametes. It's just never really been socially necessary. It's not socially necessary in most contexts, right? Which to me provides some sort of a distinction and probably a flaw in that definition in general. The idea that we can strictly define what a man and a woman is. Now, I think that it's probably important to recognize that these premises are true because I think a world where less people feel anguish regarding their gender identity is probably a good one. More directly, a world where less trans people feel suicidal, depressed, or ultimately kill themselves is a better world, in my view. A world with less needless suffering than otherwise, is warranted. It's this empirical argument that I've yet to hear most transphobes or anti-trans thinkers respond to. After all, it's their burden to prove that stigmatizing these people actually works. If we value a world with less needless suffering, then we ought to strive for a world where trans and non-binary people are respected to the reasonable extent that they desire, which effectively takes the form of respecting their pronouns and giving them access to societal resources of the gender with which they identify, should they request such resources. And that's where I'll end it.
I did not. I just let that one go. I think he kept it within the confines.
Okay. All right.
Cool. I'm just timing myself.
Yeah, timing yourself. So let's get a few things straight. First and foremost, when we're talking about categorization, the best thing to do for categorization is to be specific. Like the specific categorization of a mountain lion. If a mountain lion was a dog, we wouldn't consider a mountain lion anymore because it wouldn't be one. Second, EconoBoi says specifically that gender is a social construct and that's fine because social constructs can be useful. Well, that's true. Social constructs can be useful, but there's also times when a social construction may not be useful. And the examples of that are innumerable. And if he wants me to cite any of them, I'm happy to do so. He says we ought to respect how a person identifies. What if they identify as a dog or a cat or an attack helicopter or any number of different things that they can identify as? He says all we need is proof to the contrary so that we no longer identify them that way. Well, we have proof to the contrary. They're not women. They're not men any more than they're attack helicopters. As we go through this, here's what you're going to find. Number one, the biggest thing is that what creates a man is the production of small gametes, and what creates a woman is the production of ova or large gametes. Now, there are isolated instances where people cannot produce large or small gametes. So what we default to for the determination on whether they're a man or a woman is what they were supposed to produce. This is inarguable. It's easily provable. It's scientific fact. But even if you want to get rid of all of that, understand that gender as a construction is so arbitrary that EconoBoi will never in a million years be able to define what it is because nobody knows. They take fashion and explain fashion as being gender. The only thing that's ever pointed to is, what if a man wears a dress, therefore he's a woman? It's insane. Fashion is the only gender distinction that EconoBoi will be able to present, and it's not even a distinction, it's just a social normality and nothing more than that. Fashion is all that will be cited as gender here because there is no way to categorize it in a way that's useful. It's impossible. It's a made up arbitrary bullshit that was come up with by people who like to dress as women or dress as men and pretend that they are, when in fact they are not men, they are not women, and there's no way on planet Earth that EconoBoi will be able to prove that they are. What he will do is he'll make a phenomenal case for why transgender people, generally speaking, are mentally ill. I don't define anything out of somebody who's suffering from gender dysphoria as being transgender, as there's nothing that you can point to that makes them transgender other than whatever their fashion statement may be. And with that, I'll yield my time.
All right. If do we have different rounds, or do you guys know how long you want to go for?
Probably hour and a half.
Okay.
Usually about the time frame of these debates after the opening statement. I'll yield it over to you, Tom, to make the distinction when to stop.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's about 8:30 now, so I'll check in with you guys in a little bit, and then EconoBoi, if you want to go ahead with your next argument.
Yeah, sure. So, as far as I'm aware, I think this is kind of the open, more the open part of the debate, and
Yeah.
I suppose that my response to these kind of things, it's best for categories for things to be specific. I suppose that's true in a lot of cases. It doesn't mean that when categories become more nebulous, they necessarily become less useful in a lot of things.
Awesome.
I can
So
come
what's
up with
gender? Just tell me what gender is.
So gender, like I said, is a social construct. There's typically presented as a binary, men or women, but then there's also non-binary people. To me, that's pretty much what gender is.
Well, that doesn't tell me anything. What is it?
How
can I distinguish what your gender is?
Yeah, so I would say that generally, if you wanted to distinguish people by their gender, you would probably want to first look at, socially how we construct gender. There's obviously, typically distinct categories, men and women, and then you'd want to look at the characteristics thereof that typically map onto that social reality. But then beyond that, what you probably want to look at is how people identify and go a little bit more in depth from there.
So what if they identify as an attack helicopter? What would be the characteristics that I should look to define that they are not an attack helicopter? Like, could I use my eyeballs and determine that they're not an attack helicopter?
Well, yeah, as far as this discussion is concerned, we're kind of talking about, trans people, not sort of xenogender people. Now, if we want to have a
conversation talking about xeno, I'm talking about trans people.
Well, what are you talking about? Trans people don't identify as attack helicopters.
I didn't say that they did. I'm drawing something that's analogous, meaning that you identify as something that you're not. Is there a way for me to determine if you're telling the truth or not?
Well, I think the difficulty here is that when you're talking about an attack helicopter, we're talking about sort of a physically more quantifiably determined thing versus
then
gender, which
woman,
is more of an.
That seems pretty physically identifying, doesn't it, EconoBoi?
Well, I think it sounds physically identifying to you because it sounds like you don't really recognize this as more of a socially constructed thing. But I would recognize it as more of a socially constructed thing, and that's where I would determine the distinction between identifying as a man or a woman versus identifying as an object or, a different species or something like that.
I see. So let me ask you a question. Assume that there's a woman who identifies as a man, but wears nothing or does nothing to change her physical appearance. What would you assume that she was?
Well, what do you mean by woman?
I mean an adult human female by definition.
Okay, so yeah, you're talking about someone who is assigned the female sex at birth, I suppose. They have a vagina, but they identify
That's not
as
what
a
I
man.
Asked. So let me try it one more time.
I'm just.
If there is
a
woman who walks over to you She's clearly a woman. You can see that she's a woman, and says that she's a man. What is it about the characteristics that you would draw on to determine that she was telling the truth?
Right. So again, you're sort of begging the question, well, within the question itself.
The question
right?
deserves to be begged. Literally, this is one of the
Well,
few questions that deserves to be begged. So why shouldn't I beg it?
Well, I'm not. Well, it's just you could ask it more directly. I think the better question
I
is
don't
what
know how
makes a
more
woman or a
direct
man.
I could be. How much more direct could I possibly be?
So you're saying a person is a woman, but they identify as a man. If the whole entire debate is about whether or not you can identify as a woman or a man, it seems to call into question what is a woman or a man in the first place. Now, to answer your question directly, not to obfuscate, obviously you're talking about someone assigned female at birth who presents sort of as a societal woman, socially sort of accepted, constructed woman, but who tells you in a conversation that they are in fact a man.
Yeah.
Now, to me, I would have no reason necessarily to question their identity. Similarly to, if I was talking to you and, if we went to the fascist family reunion and I wanted some of your, some of your Christmas dinner or something like that, and we were talking and you mentioned you're a Christian, it's pretty hard for me to quantifiably determine whether or not you're a Christian.
It's not hard
right?
to quantifiably determine it. You could ask one question to determine it.
Well, I disagree with that, but generally you get what I'm saying.
There's no disagreement. There's one requirement, literally.
Really? So there's only one requirement to be a Christian, no others?
To determine if somebody else is a Christian, yeah.
Okay, what's the requirement?
Do you have faith that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior?
And that's the only requirement to be a Christian. So outside of any other characteristic,
that
everyone's
would be
equally a Christian.
That would be the thing that you would utilize as the requirement. Yes. Now,
how do I know?
Let me ask you this.
But how do
whether
I know?
Whether I know it or not, you would know that you now know it because you have some type of evidence that has been demonstrated for you.
Well, now, I know what you said.
Besides that, let me ask you this question. The reason I asked you specifically about this: if you have a man, a adult human male, and you have a woman, which is an adult human female, and one of them decides, let's say the female, to transition to a male, and they don't have any surgery or anything like that, or even assuming they do, it doesn't really matter. If they engage in sex, are they now in a homosexual relationship in your view?
Sure. So to go back one step, I would say that I do eventually want you to respond to the idea that I actually don't know if you truly believe that, Jesus is the Son of God and sort of God himself, right? So I think that that's an important issue to determine whether or not we would take self-identification seriously. Now, in terms of the question of,
well, if we don't, that's even more better. That's even more better for me, not good for you, but go ahead.
Well, sure, but then I think your worldview where you don't take self-ID seriously sort of falls into some absurdist, non-functional worldview where...
Well, then we would have to rely on evidence, right?
Well, but there's no necessarily objective way to determine if someone's truly a Christian because we're not taking them at their face value. I don't know if someone truly believes what they believe in or not. I have to take it at their face value.
Let's assume for a second that you're right, okay? If somebody said that they were a Christian and then went and prayed in a satanic church, would you consider that evidence against them being a Christian?
Yeah, I would say so. And
you would say so. So let me ask you a question again. Back to what I was asking you. If you have a female who transitions into being a male and another male has sex with this female, are they in a homosexual relationship?
Right. Okay. So I guess moving on from that previous point to talk about the idea of, if someone is, assigned female at birth and then ends up in a relationship with someone assigned male at birth, and then all of a sudden the person who's assigned female at birth transitions to being a man, they get the surgery and everything what you're describing. You're asking, is that at that point, does that relationship go from heterosexual to homosexual?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say that it probably does.
Can you define homosexual for me?
It's pretty tough to. I would say that homosexuality is, generally people, men who are attracted to men. That's probably a decent enough definition of homosexuality.
I see. And can you read for me the AMA's definition of homosexuality?
The AMA's definition of homosexuality? Yeah, I'm honestly not sure, but in general, what I would say is that the determination of what is gay and what is straight is probably a little bit more complex than how you were assigned at birth, but maybe that's just me. We can talk about it.
No, I'm asking you specifically. What does the AMA say the definition is of homosexuality?
Well, I've already said I don't know, and I provided perhaps an alternative to
They
what I would
claim
hear
that
sexuality.
homosexuality is same-sex relations.
Okay. Do you often rely and cite the AMA? I mean, I'm not sure, but
Whether I do or I don't you?
as far as I'm aware, I haven't cited the AMA in this debate. Now, to
I
answer the
see.
question specifically,
So hang on, just to make sure I
yeah,
got this right. Are
let's
you
hang on.
saying that you would think that the AMA definition of homosexuality would be incorrect if it means that it's same-sex attraction?
Yeah, I think we could probably develop scenarios where that wouldn't strictly be probably the most intuitively correct position.
It wouldn't be the most intuitively correct position. So the AMA, the American, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I got this right.
All
You're
right, make sure.
saying that I'm sorry, the APA, not AMA, APA.
My goodness.
You're saying that you think that the APA is incorrect.
Yeah, if the APA defines in such a strict sense homosexuality as same-sex attraction, I would say so. I can present scenarios where I think that probably doesn't make the most sense.
Okay, gotcha. I just want to make sure that I have this down pat. So you'll see in the private chat, I've linked this over to you so that you can see for sure what it is they consider homosexuality. Can you read that out loud for me?
Well, I assume it just says what you said. Yeah, so sexual attraction or activity between members of the same sex, although the term can refer to homosexual orientation of both men and women, current practices distinguishes between gay men, lesbians, and homosexuality itself, now commonly referred to as same sex or sexual orientation or activity, homosexual.
So it sounds to me like the APA, the American Psychological Association, considers same-sex activity to be between two sexes, not between two genders.
Yeah.
Isn't that
Sure.
interesting?
Do you think that being
So then
trans
one
is
more
illegal
time,
enough?
can I ask you
Well, no,
then?
no. Well, I've already answered the question. Again, I've offered to give scenarios where this definition probably doesn't make the most common sense. But
Yeah, sure.
if
Give
you'd
me
like
the
to take an
scenario
example.
where it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, sure. So if we're talking about what makes someone homosexual or heterosexual, let's talk about this scenario. So one scenario might be say there's a woman who's a lesbian, right? Assigned female at birth, and they're attracted to women, right? Now let's say that they end up in a relationship with a trans woman who's transitioned. Post-op, they have the neo-vagina and everything, right? Let's say that the way that they started this relationship was they met each other at a bar. They didn't really care to ask genders, pronouns or anything like that because both of them sort of look socially what we would consider women. Nobody really determined a question. Similar to how, like I said, I didn't question my wife's sort of gender when she told me she was a woman. They end up in a relationship. This ends up getting disclosed at some point, and they have sex pretty regularly, right? Going down on each other, just having all kinds of fun. Would you say that this relationship, right, a woman who is assigned female at birth and a woman engaging in regular sexual intercourse in a relationship with a trans woman with a neo-vagina, would you say that this is a purely heterosexual activity?
No, I would say absolutely. It's defined by being same-sex activity.
Sure. So you would say that a woman who is assigned
I
female
would
at
say
birth.
anybody who has same-sex activity is a homosexual.
Okay, well, sure. I suppose that in general, I would say that that doesn't really make the most sense. I think that there's a lot of
I think
maybe
it does
particularly.
make the most sense because what is the distinguishing characteristic between the two? One produces ova and the other one produces small gametes. If for some reason there's some biological reason that they cannot do that, you can default to what they were supposed to produce, which is how we determine sex now, even in the natural world, meaning with livestock, everything beyond human. Why wouldn't I classify people of the same sex having sex as being homosexual when the actual term homosexual means same sex?
Well, sure, because we're talking about a more socially constructed thing, right? So, for
It's not
instance, if
socially constructed. It's a distinguishing merit for behavior. It explains an actual behavior, which is two of the same sexes having sex.
sure, so would you say a lesbian would generally prefer a penis or a vagina?
I would say that they would prefer probably a vagina.
Right. Okay, so if you've got someone who's a lesbian who is now
Mhm.
attracted and in a relationship with someone who happens to be a post-op trans woman, why are they less gay? Because that person has a vagina.
Because they're not of the same sex. So they're not homosexuals.
But do you think that a
What
homosexual
does
is
homo
attracted?
mean?
No,
What
no, no,
does
no, no,
homo mean?
Andrew, no, no, no. We're not gonna get off this because I think this is an important point. So,
Yeah, I think it's
can you get,
important too. You're
Well,
identifying
yeah, let
secondary
me,
sexual
we gotta let
characteristics.
EconoBoi
and,
finish real quick.
yeah,
Okay.
And that's what people are attracted to generally when
No,
they're
it's
a
not.
homosexual. No. Well, Andrew, let me ask the question. I feel like this question is devastating to your case. The question is a lesbian or a gay person, say I'm a gay man, am I attracted to someone's genome? Do I just say, oh, fuck, this guy's got a Y chromosome? Or is it really more so the physical secondary characteristics that I'm attracted to that make me gay?
If you're a male homosexual, you're probably suffering from mental illness.
Well, you didn't answer my question, did you?
What you're attracted to is likely the primaries, the same reason that you're attracted to women. Actually, women do give off pheromones for attraction, just so you know.
Wow. Okay, we're going a little off the deep end here. So I'm going to ask my question a third time. So if I'm a gay man, am I attracted to the genome of the person that I'm trying to fuck, or in fact, am I attracted to their secondary characteristics?
No. So to answer that specifically,
am I attracted
no,
to their secondary? Am I attracted to their secondary characteristics?
Possibly.
What do you mean possibly? How can a gay man?
Possible. Well, so I reject this whole notion that people aren't attracted to primary sex characteristics like genitalia. I think that that's absurd and not true.
Well,
like, for instance, I like vaginas. Just so you know, real vagina, I like them. Don't you like them?
For that. Well,
don't you like them?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with liking vaginas.
So don't you think that if a gay man dropped the drawers and found out that you didn't have a penis, he might be pissed off?
I'm not sure he would be pissed off, but I'm sure he probably wouldn't be fine.
He'd be like, "That's cool, bro."
Well,
we know you were pretending the whole time.
No, but you just conceded my point. So if gay men are attracted to penises, right? And let's say that this gay man is now in a relationship with a post-operative trans man who has a penis. Would you say that that makes him any less gay? I would say it doesn't.
If they drop the drawers and have sex with somebody who has a micro penis, then what they're actually doing is they're engaging in opposite sex activity. What you're doing is you're saying there's no what. What you're saying
is someone with a micro penis
I'm trying to answer your fucking question, man. So let me try to.
Statement you just made.
It's not ridiculous. What you're saying is that a magician's illusion makes it reality. It doesn't make it reality. It's not actually is it same sex activity or not?
So again, I don't.
You're not answering my fucking question. Stop running from it. Is it same sex activity?
What do you mean by same sex?
They have the same sex. They both produce the same gametes, or they have the same chromosome X, Y, or XX. Is it the same sex or isn't it?
Okay, yeah. So to answer your question directly, you'll just gotta give me more than 1 second to answer your question directly there. So to answer your question directly, in a sense, yes, right? So if you've got a scenario where
in a sense, is it the same sex or not?
I'm answering the question. Just
say yes or no. It's a yes or no question. It's not loaded and there's no presuppositions. Is it or isn't it?
It is a loaded question, so I have to explain a little bit. It's just two sentences.
Of course it is.
Yeah. So the two sentences that I have to explain is that if you're defining homosexuality as an attraction between the same sex people, and by sex you mean someone with the similar chromosomal makeup, then yes, a trans man having sex with a person assigned male at birth is same-sex activity. But what I'm trying to distinguish from is the idea that homosexuality probably has more social connotations than you're letting on. Again, you haven't properly answered the point. The idea that if I'm a gay man, I'm not attracted to someone's chromosomal makeup. I'm attracted to probably the secondary characteristics, and like you said, a penis, most likely, right? And so if I'm having sex with a trans man who's post-op and has a penis themselves, how does that make me any less gay than someone?
Fair enough. What if they're not post-op?
Yeah, if they're not post-op, I think that each gay person would probably need to make their own decision at that point.
Would it still make them gay?
Would it make? What do you mean? Would it make them gay if they're not post? If a gay man
fuck a woman who has all the right plumbing, there hasn't been any type of magic trick done that reconstructs the genitalia. Are they gay then?
Yeah, so I would say the answer is yes, but you haven't properly responded. You haven't properly responded.
Yes, I can properly respond. What does homo mean?
So what you said originally
you still won't answer my question. I'm going to get to yours, but please answer mine. What does homo mean?
Like the Latin version, I think it means like same or same of or something like that.
And what does sexual mean?
Sexual?
Mm-hmm.
Or
sexuality?
I'm not sure. Sexuality,
homosexuality, since it's called homosexuality, means same sex literally because that's the fucking name.
Do you think words have no? Do you think words have no additional social connotation to what they, currently do? I mean, of
Some
course they
do,
do.
but most of the time they're very specific.
I understand that, but I'm challenging the
Mhm.
specificity of your definition, aren't
Well, the
I? Right?
specificity
Now,
is very simple. Homosexuality means same sexuality. It's literally in the name. And so
look, I agree that.
when I ask you this question, which is a gay man gets home with a trans woman, or I'm
Yeah.
sorry, a trans man, takes all their
Okay.
clothes off, they have a vagina, they haven't had any reconstructive surgery, and they have sex with that person. In your worldview, that's still a gay man.
Yeah, I think it could be for sure. It just depends on the
Uh-huh.
gay person and how they would feel about themselves. But what you said, let's
Mhm.
go back to what you said at the beginning of
Even though
this
they're
sort of
not
line of
engaged
questioning.
in any type of actual homosexual activity, they're engaged.
Well,
So let me. So if me and my wife,
well,
if my
let
wife
me let
wakes
me.
up, so if my wife wakes up tomorrow and she says, "I'm
Uh-huh.
a man," and I lean over and I have sex with her, that means I'm gay.
No, I wouldn't say that. Do you feel like you're gay?
Wait. Back up. I wouldn't be gay, but she said she's a man.
I'm not. I don't understand the point of the question. So, of course, I wouldn't consider you gay if you don't feel that you're gay. Now, if we're gonna try and talk about what
So gay is
definitionally
a
makes,
feeling. So gay is a feeling, not an action.
It was like
well,
a kind of
sure.
boy
I mean, that's
finish real
kind.
quick.
Yeah. So I would say that, of course, being gay and your sexuality has to be a feeling. Of course, it's an attraction to a certain set of characteristics or a certain sort of societal category, right? So if you, Andrew, are attracted to people with vaginas, people with sort of, what we would consider sort of the classic secondary characteristics of people assigned female at birth, and your wife leans over to you, at night and says, I identify as a man now. If you're still attracted to her, I wouldn't consider you gay because what you're being attracted to is those sort of similar secondary characteristics that you always have been. I don't think that's unreasonable, but the
So her
unreasonableness.
identity at
Well, hold
that
on.
point doesn't matter.
No. Her identity, of course, matters, but I'm also
Well,
taking
then
into
why
account
am I
your
not
identity
gay? Then why am I not gay if she identified as a man? If her identity
because
is what we should be going off of.
you're operating under an incredibly rigid sort of definition of sexuality and gender, which I am not operating under. Obviously, that's the disagreement. Now let's go. I've been trying to go
Real
back to
So
what
quick,
you
just
hey,
said.
making
EconoBoi, can you define what gay is or what it means to be gay, real quick?
Sure. So I would say that someone who is gay is generally someone who's attracted to what it means oftentimes to societally be a man, right? So what does that mean, right? So
yeah, what does that
oftentimes
mean?
gay. Right. So oftentimes what gay men are attracted to is, more masculinizing characteristics, right? What does that mean? Often it means a penis. Often it means, sort of the testosterone characteristics, being more hairy, being more masculine, having, bigger bone structure, stuff like that. And obviously the type of sex act they're interested in also probably matters as well. That's sort of a generic on the spot definition that I can come up with. Now, for the fifth time, I want to go back to something that Andrew said. You mentioned having sex with someone with a micro penis necessarily means that you're not gay at that point. So I have a question for you. So if you take man A and he has a micro penis and he's gay, and then you've got man B who just has a regular old American penis and he's also gay. These two people meet at a bar and they have sex with each other. Are you really making the case that someone who has a small micro penis is necessarily not a man at that point? It just sounded like a very
Yes,
weird point.
it's not a man. It's a
So
woman.
someone with a small penis is a woman.
They don't have a small penis. They have a piece of skin that's grafted on for the illusion that they have a penis.
Oh, I'm confused. When you said micro penis, you were talking about a trans man's penis. You weren't talking about just micro penises in general.
Yes.
Okay, well that was very confusing. I was wondering if you were going to make the case that having a small penis would make you a woman, which sounded like a pretty funny line of
Well, no,
questioning.
that would make you a woman. I would never say that. No, I'm kidding. I couldn't help it. I
Wow.
couldn't help
Wow.
it. I couldn't.
Can't
Hey,
believe it.
you started the debate with some shit talking. You can't fucking begrudge me talking a little shit.
Hey, look, all right. My wife is my wife's 5'1" for a reason. I had to self-select. So I think generally though, well, here's a question. Do you think
Mhm.
being trans is a mental illness?
I think gender dysphoria is a mental illness.
Okay. So to be fair, I suppose you're being consistent here with regard to citing the APA. I thought I was going to catch you on that one. So you think that being trans is not a mental illness. You think gender dysphoria is a mental illness. So
That's
in the same
correct.
vein, well, you mentioned that homosexual men earlier in this conversation are mentally ill, right? So
Yeah,
how
and
do you
that was
draw a
defined
distinction?
under the APA as a mental illness until when?
I think it was the 90s or something like that. I'm not sure
It was very
exactly.
recent. Yeah, it was defined as a mental illness for pretty much ever.
Why are you defining homosexuality as a mental illness but not being trans? That seems pretty inconsistent.
I did. I said gender dysphoria, which I consider transgenderism, is a mental illness.
Well, right, but okay, well, so you do disagree with the APA selectively. That seems a bit
No, I don't
odd.
disagree with them at all. Selectively, they considered it this until there was political pressure on them to redefine it as no longer being a mental illness.
Well, you're being relatively
Just like there's
conspiratorial.
political pressure on them. No, it's not conspiratorial. Just like I can literally show you the president of the APA, the former president of the APA, saying that there was political pressure put on them in order to reclassify homosexuality as not being a mental illness. Would you like me to pull that video up for you?
It's a video or a quote? I mean, I guess a quote would
It's
probably be
literally
easier
a
to read.
video of him saying it. That way you don't, there's nothing out of context. It's up to you. I'll pull it up.
Well, sure. So I'm not sure how relevant that is necessarily, because I'm not the one strictly trying to almost at the same time strictly, but not.
Why
strictly
would
adhere to the APA's
homosexuality
definition.
be useful when the word is same sex? That's what it means. We're talking about same sex activity. And then we're going to deviate from that into secondary sex characteristic attraction. That's not homosexuality anymore.
Well, you're kind of completely pivoting the conversation. We were talking about the APA and the reliability of their definitions and sort of classifications, right? So I'm not going to answer that question. I want to stick on topic in this regard. So we were talking
yeah,
about...
run away, but go ahead.
Well, you're the one that ran away by initially pivoting in the first place.
I didn't pivot.
Oh,
I just answered your question. I was specific, and then I moved on to the qualifiers for why I was being specific.
Not at all. So the original line of questioning was to get at... Not at all. So the original line of questioning was to get into the idea that you seemingly selectively cite the APA, right? So on one hand, you're willing to cite them with regard to the definition of homosexuality, but you're not willing to cite them with regard to defining, being gay or being trans as a mental illness. And I think that that's obviously inconsistent.
They don't say that. They don't say that being trans is a mental illness. They say gender dysphoria is a mental illness. Where's my inconsistency?
They don't say that being gay is a mental illness, but
now,
you're saying being
due
gay...
to political pressure, that's true. They no longer classify it as a mental illness.
Yeah, you're saying it's political pressure, but here I would ask a question. What do you think causes... What is a mental illness in your mind?
It's an abnormality to normal, non-deviant behavior.
Sure. So do you think masturbating too much could be a mental illness?
Yes.
Okay, and why?
Because it's a deviation and it's abnormal behavior. This is the sign of mental illness, would be abnormal behavior. That's what the calling card would be. So if you were a psychiatrist, for instance, and you were trying to diagnose if somebody had a mental illness, wouldn't the first thing you would do be to look for deviations from the norm?
Well, I suppose it would depend, but by that definition, many things would be considered mental illness.
Yes, you would. You would fucking look for a deviation from normalcy. Well, why would you not? Of course you would.
Well, I suppose it's very frustrating when you try to take a more scientific approach to this. I think that by your definition, many things would be classified as mental illnesses, which aren't. I mean, by some definitions, buying a Japanese car might be considered a mental illness because that might be a deviation from the norm.
What definition would that be?
Well, by your definition that mental illness is a deviation from standard, normal behavior, quote unquote, I think that there's
I said that you would look for signs of deviations of normal behavior in order to determine.
Okay, so what?
Yeah, the behavior would also be the thing. It would be behavior, and the behavior would be a deviation away from normal behavior. It would have to deviate away from what most people would consider normal. So if you went and gambled all your money away... no, it's not arbitrary. If you went and you gambled all your money away tomorrow, that wouldn't be normal behavior. Most people wouldn't do that. So you would look at that. Sure. You would say that's addictive, right? You would try to do something about it.
But you would say gambling itself is not a mental disorder, right?
Of course not.
Right. And so this is kind of the point. This is one of the reasons why, well, I would say probably the main reason why the APA reclassified being trans and being homosexual.
No, the main reason they did it is because they had political pressure from outside gay groups.
Let me finish my conspiracy at this point. So my conspiracy is that, in fact, the APA did not reclassify being trans and being gay as mental illnesses because they just wanted to bow to some sort of liberal leftist pressure.
They didn't reclassify trans as being a non-mental illness, but go ahead.
Sure, let's go with that. So, in general, I would say that the reason that they did that was because when we think about what a mental illness is, it's not necessarily just doing something, sort of deviant behavior that deviates from the norm as well, right? That's why gambling is not in and of itself a mental illness, but gambling addiction might be a sign of a mental illness, addiction in general.
Because it would be a deviation from the norm.
Similarly to how, like I brought up the original example, masturbating is not necessarily a mental illness, but masturbating
You're fucking
so much
lying. Listen, you're lying. Gambling's not abnormal.
Okay, but you said
but gambling all of your money away, gambling all your money away when you have bills is abnormal.
Okay, sure. Let me just finish my point. So again, when we were talking about being gay wouldn't reasonably be considered a mental illness because being gay doesn't necessarily cause undue mental anguish to the point that people aren't able to sort of live their regular everyday lives, right? Some people might feel anguish as a result of sort of the ostracization, sort of rejection that they
just
feel
reclassified mental illness as anguish. Who the fuck said anything about anguish?
Okay, so for instance, I didn't just say anguish. I also said an inability to live your day-to-day life. That's where sort of masturbation.
You have the ability to live your day-to-day life if you gamble all your money away?
Well, right, sure. I mean, I suppose if you don't care about having money or any sort of functional perspective on life, that's true. You don't literally die if you gamble all your money away.
Right.
But of course,
so what the hell are you talking about then?
Okay, so you have an ability to live if you're addicted to crack and homeless on the street. Okay. However, that addiction is so destructive to your everyday sort of normal life that you could lead as an average citizen that addiction would probably be considered some form of mental illness that's worthy of treatment.
What would the mental illness be?
Addiction. You can be addicted
in and of itself is not a mental illness.
You don't think?
Well, no, I don't think. I don't think that chemical addiction is mental illness. No, it's an addiction. That's different. It's a deviation. Addiction's not mental illness. It's addiction to a chemical substance.
Okay, so would you say that? Maybe we're confusing disorder and illness here. Would you say that the APA wouldn't call someone with a severe addiction or an affliction of sort someone with essentially a clinical problem in need of some sort of remedy?
I don't understand. In what context are you talking?
Like I'm in the context of someone being addicted to something, addicted to crack or heroin or masturbating. No,
I don't think that they would consider addiction to crack to be a mental illness. No.
Would they consider it something worthy of clinical intervention though?
Maybe, but that doesn't make it some type of fucking mental disorder. It's absurd.
Okay, sure. Well, I really think you're wrong, and I think generally we would consider addiction a mental disorder of sort. But let's just move beyond it for now. I think that in general, to go back to the point on homosexuality,
what's the mental disorder? The chemical addiction is the mental disorder, or do you have mental disorders that can come from addiction?
No, the addiction itself is the thing causing all the troubles. This is the mental disorder that ought to be cured. It's
that's not a mental disorder. That's a physical addiction.
Okay, you could say it's physiological. Sure. The point is though, is that it's sort of, by that logic though, literally everything in your brain is a physiological reaction, right? I'm not sure.
No, that's not. No, that's not so. The deviation in the way that you would make conscious decisions, okay? Literally, the deviation from the norm is the mark of mental illness. Now, it's not always mental illness, but it's the mark of mental illness. So if somebody, for instance, were to, let's say the rest of the planet has sex with the opposite sex and they have sex with the same sex, you would say that that's a deviation from the norm. So it's worthy of its own specialized type of classification. Like somebody who drinks gasoline, for instance. They might be worthy of their own specialized classification.
Do you think there is something that the APA would call a mental illness that they wouldn't consider a candidate for clinical intervention of some kind?
Yeah, I think so.
Like what? What's a mental illness the APA wouldn't have a treatment recommendation for generally?
Perhaps a low degree of ADHD, for instance.
You think there would be no treatment regimen for someone who has a low degree of ADHD?
Yeah, I don't think that there would. Yeah, because there's lots of people who have been diagnosed with it and don't have any type of clinical treatment because it's very moderate. So they go, well, we're not going to put you on drugs. We're not going to treat you. We don't need to.
Right, but that doesn't mean you wouldn't necessarily want to get checked up, and that doesn't mean you necessarily wouldn't want to talk to anyone.
Yeah, but that's not what you asked, is it? That's not what you asked. No, it wasn't. You asked if they would classify anything as being a non-mental illness based on the degree, and I gave you an example, and you agree with the example, so you're pivoting.
No, I asked the exact opposite. I asked a scenario where they would classify something as a mental illness, but not have any interventions for it.
Yeah, I
Regular
just
checkups
gave you that.
are
They would probably classify a low degree of ADHD as
regular.
being a mental illness, but wouldn't recommend that you do anything about it because maybe it's not a big enough problem for you to take
Regular
any drugs
checkups.
for it.
Regular checkups are an intervention. Follow-ups are an intervention, right? So
Well, what
to go back to the
if they
homosexuality,
recommend that you don't need any of those?
to go back to the homosexuality
So what if
example,
they recommend you don't need any of those?
if someone said you have ADHD that is so mild that you don't need literally any treatment, they probably at that point wouldn't say that you have ADHD. Right?
Why not?
If you've got a mental disorder that doesn't show itself to any sort of significant degree to the point that it's
No, but it
impossible
showed
to
itself
diagnose,
to a significant enough degree that they say you have ADHD. We just don't feel that we need to treat you for it. We don't need to give you any drugs, right? If it gets way worse, then come back. Other than that, live with it. No big deal. Lots of people like that.
If a doctor says, I can't noticeably detect any symptoms regarding the illness you proclaim to have, if it gets worse, come back, would you say that they've reasonably diagnosed that person with that disorder?
Yeah.
Okay, obviously the answer would be no, right? If you walk into
the
a
answer
clinic
would be yes. If they
if
can
you-
walk in and they can say something like, you have an open wound. I have now diagnosed that you have an open wound, but I just suggest that you let it heal on its own. If it gets worse, come back. That's almost every fucking emergency room visit, buddy. Just so
right,
you
but
know.
that's not what we're describing, though, to be fair.
Well,
right?
now
What
you're
we're
pivoting
describing-
again, right? Just concede that it's true. Isn't
It's
that
not
most
true.
emergency room visits? You go in and they're like, yeah, we get that you have a fever, right? We get all this. Just go home and sleep it off. And if it gets worse, come back. Don't they actually say that?
We're not talking about, obviously.
Then why did you bring it up as a fucking example?
I didn't bring up the emergency room.
Did.
You brought up the emergency room.
Man, you did bring it up as an example.
Moderator intervention. Who brought up the emergency room?
I believe Andrew brought it up from what I could
Thank
hear.
you, Tom.
Okay, but he asked, would a doctor, if a doctor said to you, did he not?
I'm talking about a psychiatrist. Obviously, I'm not talking about an emergency room.
Now
nice,
it's a fucking okay.
Nice
gotcha.
leap.
All right, real
you
quick.
Should join the Olympic team for that.
EconoBoi, can you define what are we? Is it mental illness right now? Is that what we're on? Or mental disorder? I didn't hear your definition for that.
Yeah, I apologize. We have already sort of defined it. My definition was generally that someone who I think would generally be considered to have a mental illness or some sort of mental disorder would be some sort of action that they regularly take, or some sort of a mental abnormality that they might go into the clinic to get diagnosed that affects their day-to-day life in such a significant way as to warrant some sort of clinical intervention, whether that be regular checkups or some sort of chemical treatment or whatever have you. Now, the reason that I mentioned that, the reason that's an important distinction to what Andrew's saying, is that a mental disorder is just sort of a thing that's abnormal in general. I think that that's wrong because we would reasonably classify a lot of things as mental disorders that don't really make a lot of sense, right? Being gay itself is not a mental disorder. You might have a lot of anguish, you might have depression, you might have some sort of social ostracization or asocial personality disorder developed as a result of the ostracization associated with your being a homosexual, but that doesn't mean that being gay itself is bad or necessarily wrong or requires some sort of clinical cure or diagnosis. That's the problem here with this definition.
Sure
the same is
I
true
got
with being
this
trans.
right. From your definition, being a homosexual is same gender attraction.
What kind of pivot was that? Oh my goodness.
No, it's not a pivot. I want to be specific. Is it same gender attraction?
I think he was saying somebody who identifies as gay is who's gay. Is that not what you were saying?
Well, I mean, no, because he was talking about secondary sex characteristics. So is it same gender attraction or is it same sex attraction?
I would say it's probably closer to same gender attraction, but it's more complicated than that.
So what's gender? Again,
okay, so
I'm going to ask you this. What's gender?
Gender is generally a set of, sort of socially constructed, characteristics and affects that we generally would associate with either being a man or a woman.
So being attracted to a social construction that happens to be the same gender or however they identify, that's what you consider a homosexual.
Well, no, the characteristics themselves that make up that social construction, I think, is probably the best way to distinguish between being gay and being straight or, bisexual or what have you.
I see. Gotcha. So if you were to have sex with two different biological women, but one of them identified as being a male and had some characteristics, whatever you think those need to be, of being a male, you would consider them to still be a homosexual, even though they were having penetrative vaginal sex. They would still be a homosexual in your mind.
If two people assigned female at birth had sex with a biological man, would they be a homosexual? I'm confused.
That's not
by
what
the
I
question.
asked you, so I'm going to ask you one more time.
I'll try
You
again.
have
Maybe I didn't
two
understand.
biological women. One of them identifies as a man and has some sort of secondary sex characteristic that you would consider masculine, or whatever the fuck you want to call whatever secondary sex characteristics you think are masculine. You can't actually name any that women don't actually have as well, but let's leave that aside. He's having penetrative vaginal sex with both of these biological females. You would still consider him to be a homosexual.
Well, if a gay man is having a vaginal sex with, I guess you suppose a person assigned female at birth and another person assigned female at birth who identifies as a man, would that person be considered a homosexual because he's attracted to the masculine features of, I suppose, the women he's having sex with? Yeah, I think within reason we could call that person still a gay man. I mean, if you're attracted to the masculine features of the person you're having sex with, sounds a little gay to me. But that's
so you
just
want to
me.
actually, so what you want to actually do is reterm homosexuals, not meaning same-sex activity, but meaning same gender activity, right?
Andrew, I've said this entire time that your rigid definition
I'm glad
chromosomal attraction is ridiculous on multiple
I didn't
fronts.
say chromosomal attraction at all.
Well, that's what you're talking about.
What's a okay, no. First of all, I already gave you the criteria for gametes. I gave you the criteria for chromosomes. I've given you the criteria. There's multiple ways to identify sex. But all of that aside, all I want you to do now is tell me, what is the difference between the genders that's not arbitrary?
I would say that given the fact that gender, as I'm calling it, is a social construct, I would say that
it's all arbitrary.
It's all arbitrary to a certain extent.
It's all arbitrary. Well, so there's no actual specific criteria. So you're just making shit up.
So I'm not. So calling something a social construct does not mean you're making it up.
I didn't ask you to call it a social construct. You're calling it a social construct if it's made up. I'm asking you about arbitrary versus non-arbitrary. Is it arbitrary, your definition, or not?
Okay, so to answer your question for a second time and to add on a little bit, gender, what constitutes a man or a woman is arbitrary. But going back to my original opening statement, what we would call a mountain lion is arbitrary. That doesn't mean that the category of mountain lion is useless. Hold on. Well, first of all, it absolutely is. Second of all,
what's arbitrary about it?
Second of all, what I would say is that doesn't make the category of man and woman necessarily useless or have no utility at all. Words are ultimately arbitrary completely.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. So what's arbitrary about a mountain lion?
Yeah, sure. How do you distinguish between a mountain lion and a puma?
The size, the weight, and all of the differences that are there between the two. However, we can consider them to be the same species, meaning that they're both cats, they're both felines, right? But if I were to distinguish between a male mountain lion and a female mountain lion, what do you think I would do to distinguish between the two? They can't identify, right? So what would I do to distinguish between the two, do you think?
So to go back, the joke is that a mountain lion and a puma are actually the same thing, right? But obviously you wouldn't know that based on the premise of the question. The point is, though, is that if you were to determine what's the difference between a male puma and a female puma, you'd probably look at their sex characteristics.
Okay, and then one would have testicles and one wouldn't, and that would probably be the dead giveaway, right?
Amongst other things, sure.
Yeah, so only within human beings can you identify. So let me ask you a question. If a male puma had sex with another male puma, would you classify that as being homosexual behavior?
Yeah, I guess if I was interested in
homosexual behavior only is attributed to animals and not to human beings. With human beings, we need to classify it along how they identify, not along the actual behavior.
Well, do you think there's no reasonable behavioral distinctions between an entity that can self-identify?
Of course there is, but that's not what I asked.
Well, it's an important premise to your question. I reject the premise of your question, right? So obviously,
how you've already conceded it. What do you mean?
obviously, a being that can self-actualize and identify, we would probably behaviorally and socially treat differently than a being that cannot. So when we're talking about an animal versus a human, that's why we probably have a different set of social rules. Why don't we just walk around naked? That's what all animals do.
So once again,
Answer my question.
What you're saying, well, because
Like,
we'll die if we walk around naked of
wait, what if
fucking
we live in a temperate
exposure.
climate? Why don't we?
Even if you
what
lived in
if
a
we
well,
live
if you lived in a temperate climate, that would be even better for identification, wouldn't it? That'd be even better for identification, where
you're
people
not
walk
answering my
around pretty much naked, right? We
You're not
would be
answering
able
my
to
question.
identify. Well, what's the question? What am I missing?
You're making a biologically essentialist argument. The idea that, well, if we can identify sort of the distinctions between the sexes of, cougars based on their penises and vaginas, why don't we do the same for humans? I'm asking you, why don't you walk around naked everywhere if it's warm enough?
Because what we have is we have a set of ethical standards that prevent that from happening.
Right, because we're different than animals, right?
I didn't say that we weren't. What I'm saying is that when we're classifying the identity of sex, why would it be different between humans and animals?
Because again, we have
Because
self-actualization.
you just
We
want
have
to move to the social
self-actualization.
construct. Mm-hmm.
Well, no, we have self-actualization and self-conception that I think makes.
But you can't be an attack helicopter, right?
Well, we're not talking about xenogenders.
Yeah,
but
we
again,
are. We're talking about self-identification. That's what you just said.
He's not talking
Okay,
about xenogenders. He's asking how you can differentiate one from the other.
Right. So again, I would say that there is probably a meaningful distinction. I think I answered this probably an hour ago, right? Which is to say that there's probably a meaningful distinction between identifying as sort of an actual physical object, an entity, versus what is more of a societal construct, which is known as gender.
I see. And what would you say that would be at birth when somebody can't self-actualize for you?
Well, by your logic, a young boy cannot produce small gametes, so we wouldn't call him anything.
I didn't say that's the only criteria. I said that the criteria is XYXX chromosomes, or then you default to gametes, or then you default to what would be normal gamete production. This is how it's always been done.
Yeah, sure. What about people with XXY chromosomes?
What about them?
Well, what would they be?
XXY chromosomes still produce only one type of gamete because gametes are binary.
Oh, okay. So it's kind of a one or the other kind of thing.
Why don't you look up for me if gametes are binary or not and tell me what it says?
Well, you're not answering my question. Is it just kind of a one or the other?
I just did answer your question. Somebody who produces
question with a question.
So if you were to look at somebody who had mixed chromosomes, an actual intersex person, they still only produce one type of gamete.
I'll be 100% honest. I don't know if that's actually true.
Well, it is actually true. The only exception to this would be in this bizarre, extraordinarily rare, barely can ever fucking identify it condition called chimerism. It's literally called chimerism. But
never
even
heard of
then, I know most people haven't, but it's true. It's called chimerism. You're a chimera. But even then, you can't impregnate yourself and have your own children. You only ever produce one type of gamete for your sex organ, period. That's why it's always been such a useful identifier.
Sure. I suppose okay. Let's move on from here because obviously
no. Let's not move on from here because I want to know when a person.
I have my own questions I want to ask.
When a person is fucking born,
when they're fucking
how
born,
would you classify their sexuality other than their gamete production or their chromosomes? How would you do it, EconoBoi?
How would I do it? I mean, I think you could probably make an argument for not classifying it at all, but I would say that the common practice of assigning a sex on your birth certificate probably makes enough sense. I don't really know if it's that big a deal, but I haven't really looked into it that much, if I'm honest. Now,
okay, so your sex assigned at birth is your sex, right? Because it's an actual thing.
Assigning a sex at birth is different from assigning a gender at birth. Obviously,
nobody said to assign a gender. I'm just talking about sex right now.
Well, I understand, and I never. Of course, I mean, in my opening statement, which you haven't really contended, was the idea that obviously, if we're in a scenario where someone's genitals are useful as a distinguishing category, then that's fine to use that as a distinguishing category. All I'm saying is that in the social connotation of interactions, sexual relationships in general, someone's genitals and someone's XY sort of chromosomal makeup is not always the most sort of commonly useful thing to go off of, and typically self-identification with some set of social characteristics and how they present is probably more useful. Now,
Why
again,
is it more useful when almost nobody goes outside of the purview of the actual sex they're born with?
And here we go. This is part of the reason. This is part of the thing I wanted to get into. So, number one, it's useful because obviously there's exceptions. And number two, I would say that what we haven't responded to this entire time is the empirical argument. So my question would be this: do you think that the category of man and woman, as strictly defined the way that you see it, is useful? Like, is it better? Is it a better
strictly
society?
Defined as how it's defined by every definition you can find as an adult human male or adult human female. Can you give me a definition that doesn't define it that way?
Pretty sure if I looked up man, I might find some socially constructed.
Well, why don't you look it up right now? Look up man. I'll wait.
Hold on. No, we're not going to get off this because I don't want to Google anything in this line of questioning. But because that's really not the point of the question, Andrew. The point of the question is to say, do you think the definition as strictly defined by yourself is useful? Is it a better world than otherwise?
Yes.
Okay. And do you think that the sort of, do you think that my definitions of gender, do you think they're socially destructive? And if so, how?
They're arbitrary. They don't mean anything.
Why does that make them bad?
It makes them bad because nobody understands what the criteria is supposed to be. So you can self-identify as anything. And let me give you an example of how. And this is what I wanted to get to. Can you be transracial?
I just had a long conversation about this with Rim today. Rim is a philosophy streamer. The honest answer is I'm not sure. I think there's a good argument that you can be,
sure.
But
well, it's arbitrary. It's arbitrary, right? Who cares? Why don't you just say you're a different race? Who cares?
Well, it's a relatively deep philosophical question. I think that what I've sort of come to...
relatively deep philosophical question. You can't just say no. Just say no. You can't be fucking transracial. It's nonsense. Can you be trans-species? Can you be a dog? If you identify as a dog and you say wolf?
Yeah, I think that that's similar to like identifying as like an attack helicopter, right? There's probably a difference between identifying as, a sort of distinct object or entity than identifying as a different race.
You're identifying as a distinct entity when you say that you're a man if you're a woman.
Well, so no, because again, the category of man and woman is a highly socially constructed concept.
No, it's not highly socially constructed. We already established that what makes a man or a woman is adult human male or adult human female. Unless you can show me a definition. Can you show me a definition other than that anywhere?
A definition of a man that doesn't include like having a penis, basically.
Adult human male. Do you agree that male means person with XY chromosomes or person who produces small gametes or person who was supposed to produce small gametes?
Yeah, that's one way to use the term. Sure. I mean, again, if we're talking about sort of a scientific
it's fucking insane. Listen to what you're saying.
Yeah, it's really not.
If you can just take it and say, okay, all of these things make me male, but I dismiss them on arbitrary categorizations that nobody can define, and now I'm a woman. Why can't you be black?
If I'm a woman, why can't I be black?
That's not what I asked. I said, if you can dismiss these things based on arbitrary categorizations, why can't you dismiss race based on arbitrary categorizations?
Well, okay, so again, I'll go back to
you don't even believe race is real, right? That's the scientific. The scientific method right now says that there is no such thing as race. So what would be wrong with being transracial?
Well, right, that was part of the discussion. If you want to have a deep conversation of transracialism, we can. I suppose to have a cliff-noted version. I think there's probably merit to the idea that because race is a social construct and being black isn't some sort of, it's not born out of the ether, it's just correlated with your skin color, that it's probably reasonable to say that to a certain extent, you can identify with black culture. You can even go so far as possibly to identify as black, but not actually be black-skinned. There's a lot of arbitrarity in that definition as well. Now, we're not having that conversation, to be fair, and I want to question.
Yeah, no. Transgender leads to transracial. What about transageism?
Okay, so
can I identify as a 10-year-old, and then if I have sex, I have been molested?
So identifying as an actual chronology is obviously different than identifying with sort of a purely socially constructed thing.
I didn't say that they weren't different, but they're both social constructs. Age is a social construction, yeah.
Well, I mean, you could say that, I suppose, but I mean, age is just an identifier of how many times you've been around the sun on Earth. Right?
Any of this is just an identifier that's arbitrary by your own merits. So if I identify as an 11-year-old, how come I'm not an 11-year-old?
Okay, because you haven't. Well, how old? I don't know. You're like 30 or 40, right? Maybe. To be fair, I'm not sure. You might be in your 60s or 70s. I'm not sure. But the point is just to say that if you're say 30 and you identify as an 11-year-old, well, obviously you're not 11 because you've been around the earth more times than 11, right? So,
but that's all
sort of
arbitrary.
objective
It's all
standard.
arbitrary. It's all social construct.
Well, it's arbitrary in the sense that we've determined age to be the number of times you've been around the sun, right? But the number of times
But that's
you've
a
been around,
social construction, though.
no, Andrew, okay, going around the sun is not a social construction, right? The fact is that if you're 30, you've only been around the sun 30
but your
times.
sex isn't a social construction either. It exists in an objective reality, regardless of what your conscious thought is.
I would agree that having a penis or having a vagina is not a social construction, but calling someone a man or a woman is certainly a social construction.
You can argue your gender is social construction. You can't argue sex is. Are you arguing sex is a social construction?
Do you think that mountain lions are a social construction?
No.
Why not?
I think that they exist within objective reality.
Because they're distinct from other things, right?
Because they exist in objective reality. Gender does not.
Okay, so obviously someone with a penis is different than someone with a vagina, right? All I'm saying is that the
both
social
of those
category
people
of man
exist
and woman,
in objective
the
reality.
social category of man and woman is the social construct that I'm questioning here. Now, hold on.
So I'm asking you again about trans ageism. Age is a social construct, is it not?
I refuse to answer any. I've answered all your questions at this point. I've also answered the age question several times. So now let's talk about. I definitely have, to be fair, but let's go on to some of my questions. So, so I suppose you think, what should we do with trans people? Should we just ignore them? What's the solvency?
People with gender dysphoria should be treated for gender dysphoria.
And how are they treated?
Right now, the APA treats them using affirmation. Maybe in some cases that's okay, but I think that alternative therapies would also be okay, which would include things like Christian rehabilitation, things like this.
Well, I suppose you mean conversion therapy by Christian rehabilitation, but maybe I'm mistaken in that regard.
It would be what you would call conversion therapy, yeah.
Okay, so so you actually agree that affirming someone's gender identity is a good thing?
Yeah, I said it can be in some isolated cases, yes. Much like when you're in a hostage situation, you might say certain things so that they didn't kill the hostage, but that doesn't make it optimal that there was ever a hostage to begin with. Sometimes you have to treat these things you have to treat them on a case-by-case basis. Gender dysphoria absolutely is a mental illness, but I think there's a lot of people who claim that they're trans who don't have gender dysphoria and do not have mental illness, and they are trend sexuals. They're not actual people with gender dysphoria at all.
Wait, so you recognize that you can be trans but not have gender dysphoria?
No, I just told you the opposite. I said that there are people who claim that they are transgender, who are not transgender, who do not have gender dysphoria. Well, what do you mean pretending? Do you want me to explain to you what trans medicalism is?
You can if you'd like. I mean, I'm not sure how relevant it is, but
it's relevant to this. What's trans medicalism? It's a person who self-diagnoses as being transgender.
Okay.
Now, does that person have gender dysphoria?
They might not, no.
No, they might not, right? They just have identified themselves as being transgender, and therefore they are, because you have an arbitrary categorization that you fucking made up out of the blue that means absolutely nothing, that can be applied to anything, but you say it can't apply to ageism, can't apply to species, can't apply to race. It only applies somehow to sex, even though sex is something that could be perceived in literal reality, and gender is arbitrary and a bizarre social construction.
Well, being trans is not, I'm not sure what you think being trans is. Being trans is not necessarily a mental illness. Being trans literally is just identifying a gender that's different from
by your criteria.
Well,
my criteria is that transgender means gender dysphoria.
Okay, sure, right. If we're going with somewhat of an unacademic definition of transgender, in general, my definition
go with an unacademic version of homosexuality. Don't lecture me on academic versions of shit.
Well, sure, but the point is that at least I can explain my inconsistency, whereas you're just being sort of entirely.
I'm not being inconsistent at all. I'm explaining specifically that gender dysphoria is transgender.
You're choosing to cite an academic journal when it is convenient to you without having an objective or sort of, reasonable reason as to why that's the case. I've explained pretty in-depth throughout this conversation.
On which thing?
Well, you're citing the AMA on homosexuality, but not with regard to...
Because that's criteria you will believe.
or the APA. I apologize, the APA.
Yeah, that's criteria you will believe is what the APA says. Now, the standard on this is
Yeah,
that
sure.
the APA says that people with gender dysphoria are people who are transgender.
But you've already conceded you don't always believe what the APA says. My only
I
point
don't
in
ever
pointing that
believe
out,
what the APA says, but you do, which is why I cite it to you.
I'm not sure where you got the idea that I always believe everything the APA says. Obviously, like you mentioned, there was one point when the APA defined being gay as a mental illness, which well, I hope if I was born in the 1960s or 70s, I hope that I would be strong enough, I suppose, to disagree with that definition. But you never know, obviously.
Okay, so
You know,
back to our arbitrary gender categorizations. Same as arbitrary age categorizations, same as arbitrary all categorizations. So why is it that we shouldn't go with what's objectively real, which is your sex, which we know, always know what the sex is, versus these other arbitrary categorizations, which we wouldn't use in any other instance, including transracialism, transageism, trans anythingism.
well, you haven't determined why the category of male or female is necessarily objective. I've already conceded, obviously, that
Well,
there's
let me
people with
explain to you why
penises
it's
and people.
objective.
There's people with penises and people with vaginas, but again,
Do you want me to
sort of
explain to
social
you why it's
category,
objective?
the sort of social category of man and woman is obviously not something that's objectively
It's
true
not a
in the
social
universe.
category. Man and woman means adult human male, adult human female. An adult human male is someone with XY chromosomes, somebody who produces small gametes. They can even have XX chromosomes in some isolated cases, but as long as they produce small gametes, they're still classified as male. In intersex, this always works the same way. So I don't know what the hell you're talking about by it's not objective. It's the most objective criteria I could possibly think of.
Sure. So what if instead of man and woman we said pens and vags?
Okay.
Is it the same?
But yeah, it would be the same. So if you called it something else, let's say a senorita and a senor, right? And it meant the same thing, then it would be the allusion to sex, not gender, because there's specific categories here that we can judge for.
Right.
We can't do
So
that
again,
with gender. We can't do it with gender. You can't give me a specific category for gender.
So, well, again, I've already. It's not really a concession. Something I think it's like the first line in my real opening statement was that gender is a social construct.
Which
now,
is
again,
why I dismiss it as being arbitrary nonsense.
What I also mentioned in my opening statement was that to the extent that the distinguisher between the distinguishing factor between someone is useful in terms of whether they have a penis or a vagina, that we should use those categories. I've already agreed with you there, right? It seems that we're sort of quibbling over whether or not we should, the social category of gender is useful. And
can you tell me what gender is outside of fashion?
What gender is outside of fashion? Like what somebody wears? Do you mean?
Yeah, outside of just fashion. Can you give me a single criteria that's not shared by both sexes?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, since I would say it's a social construct, these are pretty big generalities here, but I would say that,
sure.
Yeah, and these aren't always universally true. Fashion is one that you mentioned. I would say that your use of makeup, your voice and your affect.
Yeah, fashion. Outside of fashion, anything outside of fashion that's not shared between the two sexes, anything.
Well, yeah, sure. So again, I'm not. Well, I guess if use of makeup is not fashion, I suppose you could say
that's
that.
That's fashion.
Your voice and your affect. I would say that.
Nope, those are shared by both sexes. You can have women with deep voices and women without. So what?
Well,
name anything outside of fashion that's not shared by the two sexes. Go ahead.
Well, you seem to agree to my original premise, which was the idea that obviously these things are not universal.
Stop backpedaling and name a single fucking thing outside of fashion that's not shared by both sexes.
So you agreed with my original premise that obviously because this is a social construct, these things have a lot of exceptions to them. I can only give you a general amalgamation of what a man or a woman is in societal terms.
Right? So it's all shared. It's all shared except for fashion. It's the only thing you can cite. The only thing you think gender is fashion.
Well, even with regard to sex, science would typically say that there's a bimodal distribution of sex.
No, science would not say that. There is no bimodal distribution. That's fucking bullshit. Gamete production is binary, period. X, Y, and again...
Do we believe sex or not? Or do we believe science or not? I'm confused by your...
Mainstream science doesn't say that the bimodal distribution is true. That's bullshit. It's lies. Where did you come up with the fact that mainstream science claims bimodal distribution is correct when it comes to delineating sex? They don't say that. There's no serious biologist who claims that bimodal distribution is the way to delineate sex. It's only transgender and homosexual advocates who say that. What are you talking? Yeah, psychology. Again, psychology. Give me biologists who talk about the bimodal distribution being fucking true. It's not true. Biologically, it's not true. You either produce ova or you produce sperm. And outside of that, you have XY chromosomes or XX. And then we default to what you should have if for some reason, through some freak birth defect, you can produce none of those and happen to have XX, we can still tell what you were supposed to produce.
Right. So again, I'm not sure if we believe psychologists or not when they talk about sex and gender.
I don't believe. Listen, one more time, okay? What you claim psychologists say about biology is irrelevant. Bimodal distribution is a biological phenomenon, not a psychological phenomenon.
Well, if you're studying reproduction or reproductive health, obviously the distinction between people with penises and vaginas is obviously useful. Again, you keep on trying to pin me to the idea that, oh, what the fuck? You're saying that men and women is totally arbitrary. So does that mean we can never have any utility by distinguishing people with penises from vagina? No, I can only say for the 100th time here, obviously there are scenarios where that distinction is valuable. Trans people wouldn't disagree with this. I wouldn't disagree with this. Any trans advocate wouldn't necessarily disagree with this, right? All that I'm trying to point to is
my point. My point, one more time, has nothing to do with any of that. My point is, one more time, to ask you specifically, can you name a fucking characteristic, any characteristic outside of fashion, that you would attribute as specific gender, anything?
Okay, so first of all, fashion's not even an example either, right? The point is just to say that.
So anything then.
Okay, right. So there's nothing about the social construction of being a woman that a man could not necessarily also fall into. If we talk about fashion, obviously a man can wear women's clothes. If we talk about a voice, obviously a man can have a high-pitched voice. If we talk about, the ability to be perhaps being strong or perhaps being weak, there's men that are weak, certainly, right? So I mean, there's nothing necessarily.
There's nothing that reinforces gender, not a single thing.
There's nothing that's sort of objective and sort of definitive in the universe that we could say is true or.
But we can do that with sex, can't we?
Again, if you define sex as people with penises and vaginas, sure.
That's not how I define it, is it? So, but we can definitively
you're using
say
the more sort of pedantic definition, which is just
it's
to
not
say that
pedantic. What's pedantic about it? If you have testicles and you produce small gametes, right? You're a male.
I don't know. So you're like, it's not fucking pedantic. I'm not saying you have a penis.
How is it pedantic? It's hyper specific. There's literally three criteria. What you're talking about, literally what you're talking about, and I've asked you to define it 1,000 times. You're saying this thing that I cannot define, this thing that I cannot actually articulate, this thing that I cannot say in any way is objectively real, is the thing that we should default to, rather than the thing that I agree with you is objectively real. And that, to me, sir, is fucking absurd.
Well, I understand that you think it's absurd. Again, these contexts, these conversations are relatively complex. They're more complex than just someone that produces gametes or not. Obviously, you've already conceded that in your opening statement by saying, well, obviously, there's examples where people don't produce small gametes. So we would prefer what they should produce, right, based on a normal context.
Those are just normal categorizations, though, man.
No,
what do you mean?
So I understand that. Again, I've already said that to the extent that it's a useful category, it should be used, right? All that I'm saying is that when a trans woman identifies as a woman, that's perfectly valid because woman is a social construct.
Great. So tell me what a woman is then. I've asked you 400 fucking times to tell me what the categorization would be with specifics, and you fucking can't. So you just say whatever they identify with. So why can't they be an attack helicopter? You say because there's characteristics we can point to that makes them not an attack helicopter. So what are the characteristics we can point to that makes them not a woman?
Right. So I've already explained, and I feel like I can explain for a third or fourth or fifth time if you'd like. I don't think it's that hard
until I get it.
Maybe I should go slower. I'm not really sure, but the point is that when I'm saying that someone identifies as a woman, right? What does that mean? I've already said that I can point to a general amalgam of characteristics that society would generally dictate would make her a woman. Okay, so We can talk about fashion, the fashion choices. We can talk about the use of
It's
makeup.
always
We
fashion.
can talk
Gender's
about
fashion.
we can talk about the use of makeup. We can talk about their voice and their
Fashion.
affect. We can talk about,
It's all fashion. It's always fashion.
their
What do
secondary
you have
sex
outside of fashion?
their secondary sex characteristics, right? So we can talk
Okay,
about
let's talk about the secondary sex
curves and their
characteristics.
hips and
So what makes
those
you
kind
a
of things.
woman based on secondary sex characteristics?
Well, obviously it would depend, because these aren't universal truths. It would depend on who you'd ask, but I would say that.
So you still can't identify anything that would make you a woman based on secondary sex characteristics either.
I don't understand why is this hard for you to understand, right? The idea that you can have a sort of an amalgam of a trait, like for instance, right? What makes a car? Answer me that.
Having a combustible engine.
Okay, so an electric vehicle is not a car?
That spins 4 wheels that makes it move forward. The
An electric vehicle is
categorization
not
is
a car?
simplistic. You know
An
what
electric
I mean?
vehicle is not a car?
An electric vehicle is distinguished by being an electric vehicle, yeah.
It's a vehicle, right? I asked you to define a vehicle.
Okay, sure. So we'll add electric vehicle to it. So now we have 2 distinct criteria.
Okay, what about a vehicle
you want to add into it?
What about hydrogen fuel cells?
Sure, let's go with hydrogen too. We can add all of these classifications in, and I'll agree with you that they're objectively real. The problem is that I keep on asking you to add any fucking thing to this that would describe what a woman is that doesn't apply to a man. You can't, when I can clearly name things that are ascribed to automobiles that aren't ascribed to things that aren't automobiles.
No, you can't though. For instance, like a plane. A plane has wheels and moves, and it can be electric or combustion engine or run on hydrogen fuel cells.
But a plane's not a pencil, right?
A plane is not a pencil. I would say that a plane is not a pencil, nor is a plane a car. But it's hard.
A plane's not a pencil. So I can give you specific criteria for what a pencil is, and specific criteria for what a plane is, and specific criteria for what a car is. Can you give me specific criteria for what secondary sex characteristics make you a woman?
Can you give me a criteria of a pencil that is never shared with any plane? Because that's what you're asking me to do.
Yeah, it's made out of wood.
Sure, you don't think there's any planes that ever have wood?
Not now, no.
Really? So you don't think any
interior? Maybe there's ancient planes that have existed, but I don't think there's any manufactured now that don't have steel. Or let's say lead, right? Or let's say rubber. I don't know. Maybe there's all kinds of characteristics. How about this for a characteristic? A pencil,
let's go for it.
It's always this big. Are there any planes that are that big?
Yeah, sure. You don't think a plane can be that big? What about like a toy plane?
It can't be that big. No, it wouldn't be an actual aircraft with a combustible. Or how about just that? It has an engine, and pencils don't have an engine. How about that?
Well, it depends on what you define as
one delineating factor that I can give you for specific criteria.
Mechanical. We can have a mechanical pencil, right? There you go.
It doesn't have an engine. It's not a combustible engine.
Well, you got me there. I guess pencils don't have combustible engines.
I guess they don't. So I can give you some criteria that's inside the realm of objective reality.
Right, and I can
give you thing as a secondary sex characteristic that makes you a woman.
Right, and I can give you criteria that are generally true, but not things that are
secondary sex
true.
Characteristic. You can't give me anything that actually fits the criteria, which is why it's a useless fucking category.
Well,
and it's made the fuck up bullshit.
Well, hey, I mean, I'm glad we can join each other in the gender abolitionist meeting next time around, if that's really where you're going with this.
I absolutely want to abolish gender and only utilize sex. You're right.
Oh, okay. So you're saying gender itself is a pointless category. I see what you're saying.
Not only is it a pointless category, but you can't define it in any way that's meaningful ever. And I've asked you 100 times to do it based on either secondary sex characteristics, literally anything. And you can't.
Well, wait, but you recognized but that doesn't make sense though, because you recognize that you're saying it's a useless category, but you recognized at the beginning part of this section of the debate in terms of the question period is you recognize that it could be useful for gender affirming healthcare for trans people. So if it's an arbitrary,
I said that gender dysphoria is a mental illness, and to treat that mental illness, there's a possibility that affirmations may be useful. That's what I said.
So how could it be useful to affirm an arbitrary category that doesn't exist and is ultimately
for the same exact reason that it might be useful to affirm somebody who thinks that they're the Queen of England so that they don't kill themselves?
Right, exactly. So we're going on to the empirical argument, right? So I would agree that.
Well, we've been on the empirical argument, and here's what you've given me for an empirical argument. I don't know. I don't know what the category is. I can't define it. I can't tell you what's in it. I can't tell you anything about it. It just exists.
That's not all what I've said this entire time. It's a good straw man, though. My point was just to say that there's a lot of characteristics that we would generally amalgamate to be a man or a woman. And I would say that ultimately, if you run it all the way down, it is ultimately arbitrary what we would call a man and a woman. However, that doesn't mean it's not a
No,
useful
it's not
category.
arbitrary what we'd call a man and a woman. It's arbitrary what you would call a transgender man or a transgender woman.
Sure, I guess I would argue, arguably it would be both. But the point is just to
No, it
say that
arguably would just be
there's
one,
there's a
because we've
utility.
already agreed on the criteria of what would actually constitute a man or a woman, adult human
We
male or
didn't.
adult human female. You don't believe that it would be an adult human male or adult human female, but you can't name for me what the characteristics would be outside of that. And I've asked you 50 times to do so.
Right. So we've already agreed that a categorization of people with X, Y, and XX chromosomes, people that produce small, large gametes, can be useful. Right. Again, we're really just disagreeing on the sort of social construct of man and woman, and you're saying it's totally useless. But I would say that it does serve some utility in society. Obviously, if people want to identify one way or another, that's a particular utility it could serve. Obviously, with regard to trans people who suffer from gender dysphoria, you've already said there is a utility to affirming the gender identity
So,
of
with
trans people who
specific
are
criteria of
suffering.
a mental illness, I've already said that there's a possibility that might exist that in order to prevent people from with a specific mental illness from killing themselves, that affirmations in that particular case might be appropriate under these specific criteria. So everything that I'm always giving you is specific criteria based on specific characteristics based on specific things. What you give me is I don't fucking know. That's all you give me. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Don't know. Don't know. Can't tell you. It's all arbitrary. It's all nonsense.
Well, again, there's many categories where we would call them useful, but also say that they might be relatively vague or not specific
Cool. What?
entirely. What's a harmony?
Harmony is something that has inbred dissonance with itself.
Yeah, sure. So would you say that? Well, explain that again. Maybe I didn't grab that. What do you mean by inbred dissonance with itself?
So harmony would be something that flows with itself. At least that's
That
how I would
flows.
describe it on the spot. I don't know.
Well, sure. I think it's difficult to describe truly what a harmony is. However, when we think in our heads what a harmony is generally, we might be able to come up with some basic examples, right? And we might make typical assumptions as to what a harmony is and go from there. But if you were
A
to,
combination of simultaneously sounded musical notes to produce chords and chord progression having a pleasing effect. I'll go with that. How's that for specific? Or
that
an
sounds
arrangement of the four gospels or of any parallel narrative which presents a single continuous narrative. How's that? Does that sound like criteria that we can agree on?
sure. So, well, I don't really think so. But do you think notes that are necessarily opposite from each other cannot be harmonious?
It's the definition says a combination of simultaneously sounded musical notes to produce chords or chord progressions having a pleasing effect. So that doesn't mean that chords necessarily that are not the same would not be
Sure.
harmonious. No.
Yeah, sure. What
So
if I
that's a
don't find it
definition.
pleasing?
There we go. That's a definition we can both agree on with specific criteria. Can we get to any secondary sex characteristics that we can think of outside of fashion, even if you use fashion, that cannot be ascribed to both sexes? And the answer is always no. Everything else we can come up with specific criteria on, no matter what you cite. I'll just pull up the definition. We'll probably agree on it. But we can't seem to on this because you can't give me any fucking thing specific.
Yeah, so I would just say that with regard to this issue specifically, again, there is a useful categorization of, sort of man and woman in a social construct. People oftentimes obviously map their gender identity with what they're assigned at birth. There's nothing wrong with that, right? However, with these people who have exceptions in that regard, right, that they have a difference in their sort of, assigned sex and what they identify as, I think it's perfectly valid for them to, identify as something differently from what they're assigned at birth. I think it's there's some utility to that. I think that when we talk about the social construction of what a woman and what a man is, that can be useful. But I don't think it's necessarily useful to have an incredibly rigid category of what a man or a woman is. You just pointed out to one example where this rigid category, in fact, can be toxic to certain people who suffer from gender dysphoria, right? And so I don't think there's anything wrong with legitimizing those identities, and hopefully, ultimately, leading to less suffering over time.
Do you not think it's possible to have rigid definitions that could include people with gender dysphoria?
What do you mean? Maybe I'm confused by the premise.
So what you just said a second ago was that it's harmful to some people who might have gender dysphoria to have a rigid definition. So I'm asking, do you think it's possible to have rigid definitions that would still include people with gender dysphoria?
I'm honestly not sure. Maybe you could give me an example. I haven't really thought about something like that, but in general, though, that's really my only point is that it seems that from Big Papa Fascist's perspective, the rigidity of the definition of sex and gender seems to be harmful to some people with gender dysphoria. And you've
It's
mentioned that
not
one of
rigid.
the
It's just
ways.
specific. You know,
Well,
like you say everything.
No.
It's such a rigid definite. No, it's not. It's just specific. That's it. And
Well,
anytime I ask
it's
you for
pretty rigid.
specifics about your worldview, you can't give me any, which makes me want to dismiss your worldview as being fucking absurd.
Well, right. Again, you can call it absurd, but you kind of implicitly agreed with my worldview, which is that
No, I
apparently
didn't kind of implicitly agree
let's
with
just
anything.
say that your specific definition, apparently, backing off of the specificity of that definition instead of saying rigidity, apparently can serve some social and functional utility, i.e., giving people with gender dysphoria perhaps some relief from their
But
ailments.
do you know why it gives it functional utility?
You tell me, Andrew. I'm just learning
Because it
today.
exists in objective reality regardless of your consciousness. That's why. So if you were unconscious and you were a fucking vegetable in the fucking bed and you had no idea what your sex was, it would still exist independent of your thought, and gender would not. That's what gives it so much utility.
So you're saying the existence of someone that identifies with a sex outside of what they were assigned at birth has some sort of objective meaning?
No, it has no objective meaning. It does
Wait,
not
then what-
exist in objective reality at all, whereas sex does exist in objective reality regardless of the state of the person.
Okay.
Regardless
So
of you consciously thinking about it or unconsciously thinking about it, it's still going to exist.
okay. So
Gender will not.
Well, I would agree that obviously people with penises and vaginas will exist. Again, the social category of gender might fade away. Obviously, if we're gender abolitionists, that might be the goal. But what?
Like, you're not saying anything at this point, just so you know, man. Like, you're going around in a circle over and over and over again. You're not really saying anything. What you do is you keep reframing. He's like, we agree on this, but we clearly don't agree on any of that. Like, you're just making shit up at this point, kind of.
Well, what I'm calling into question is your definition of man and woman, right? That's really what I'm calling into question. I used the example of a mountain lion in the beginning. You still haven't really properly responded to that, which is to say that mountain lions exist to some extent, right? Obviously, people with penises exist to a certain extent, but what we call a mountain lion and the exact distinct factor.
Fair enough. So let me ask you this: if all humans were dead tomorrow, would there still be mountain lions?
Would there still be mountain lions? This is an interesting question. If a mountain lion,
I don't know. Would there be?
no, it's kind of like asking, would if all humans died,
tomorrow all humans died, would there still be mountain lions?
There would still be mountain lions, but the conception of a mountain lion would cease to exist at that point.
All right, but they would still exist in objective reality, right?
Like a mountain lion itself, the thing we call a mountain lion. They would. They wouldn't just.
They would still exist in objective reality, right? But gender wouldn't, right?
Well, I wouldn't say penises would cease to exist in a world without gender as a concept, would it?
Yeah, I didn't say that. I asked you if gender would exist absent of humanity, and the mountain lion still would. And that's the difference.
So is that what you would require for you to believe in gender? BPF is like something that you think would still exist? Because obviously you do believe in and utilize some social constructs, right? So is that the difference, is whether or not it would exist?
No, it's not the only categorization. It was just specific to this particular example EconoBoi put up.
So what?
Not only that, but all I'm asking for any fucking buddy to do here to say that gender exists is give me any kind of fucking criteria that's not shared between the two sexes, and they can't.
So that's what you would want, is criteria that isn't just sex.
Yes. Anything. And it can't be done because it's fucking bullshit.
All right. I don't know if that's a good. I don't know how long we've been going.
We're at
But if you
we're a little over an hour now, so
Okay.
you
Well,
want to do closing
we can move
statements,
into
or what do you
we
want
can
to
move
do?
into closing if you guys want to. I'm fine with it.
are we gonna take
Let's do it.
questions from the audience, or are we just
Sure, you
moving
can
on
take
afterwards?
Q and A from the audience here. Tom, if you want to pop in to the Crucible live stream, you can actually see the chat there. If you guys want to send in your Q and A while we make the closing statements, you guys ought to be able to send in whatever questions that you have. EconoBoi, since you closed or opened, I'll close first if you'd like.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so essentially, this entire debate has been somewhat futile. You can see that EconoBoi can't actually define any of the terms that he wants all of us to use. He can't really tell us why they're useful. He can't really tell us anything about anything, in fact. He just tends to agree with me that sex exists in objective reality and gender does not. And he can't name anything that's not shared between the two sexes that he would consider gender at all. Nothing, right? Which makes it so arbitrary, it's not even useful. When we talk about the mental illness of people who have gender dysphoria, he seemed to want to cling on to the fact that I said in some instances where you might want to stop a person from killing themselves, that giving them some kind of affirmation would be okay so that they didn't do that. But that doesn't make it an objective reality again, nor something that society should bank itself on. The whole fucking gender concept on its face is the most absurd thing that I've ever heard in my life. It's totally arbitrary. There's no way for you to define it. There's no way for you to tell me what it is. There's no way for you to do any of these things. It's just fucking absurd on its face. There's no such thing as transgender. It's made the fuck up. When it comes to people who have gender dysphoria, which means that their brain is broken, in this one particular instance, we can refer to that as a person whose brain is broken. So we're willing to refer to this in a different way so they don't hurt themselves. But that doesn't mean that they're actually men or they're actually women. And nobody actually thinks that they are, including the transgender people themselves, who also can't explain for you any of this criteria. It's the most insane shit that I've ever heard. And the fact that people bank on the fact that you can be a homosexual, which literally means same sex, literally means same sex, and have sex with the opposite sex and you're still a homosexual just based on these arbitrary characteristics that you can't even fucking name is so absurd to me. I don't even know where to start. And I'll just close with that. I don't think I need any more.
Can you send me the link to the, because you're on Odyssey, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll send
Okay.
it over to you right now.
All right, EconoBoi, closing statements.
Yeah, sure. So, I think this debate was interesting. I would say that, in general, I don't think that BPF really ever adequately responded to the idea that a category can, of course, be a socially constructed to a certain extent, but that this category can still be useful.
I don't mean to cut you off. I'm just asking Tom if you see the link there.
Wow, sneaky debate tactics.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. You can restate the entire closing statement. I won't interrupt.
Oh, do you see the link, Tom? Or okay, good. Yeah, so I'm not sure I ever got an adequate response to the idea that something can be a social construct but also serve some sort of utility, right? So again, the distinguishment between like a deer and a chair is probably useful to some extent, right? Obviously, we can probably say that a chair within reason is not a deer, and we can also say the sort of social category of woman is distinct from man, and why is that? Why is that generally the case? And those sort of questions are useful, and they're only useful insofar as we can determine some sort of truth based off of them, and they're only useful based off some sort of social predication of what we would view as a man and a woman. And I think that that's where sort of the category comes from. That doesn't mean it's not a social construct, and it doesn't mean ultimately it's not arbitrary. All definitions that we come up with in society are arbitrary. Gender is useful to the people it's useful to, right? People ultimately, individually, have to conceptualize what they think of as a man or a woman. And to the extent that that identification is useful to them and their self actualization, it ought to be followed, right? I think in general as well, as BPF sort of admitted, the extent to which there are exceptions to this rule, he mentions people suffering from, gender dysphoria. Obviously, as he would say, apparently in select circumstances, but in generally the recommended practice for treating people with severe gender dysphoria is gender affirming care, right? So obviously you're bucking the sort of specificity of your definition when you go down that road. I would say that you're sort of bucking the rigidity of that definition, which is really what I'm sort of pushing back on, is the idea that we really need such a rigid social definition of sex and the application of your genome and sort of your secondary sex characteristics. I think it's complex. I don't think it's as simple as just saying that you have basically you have a penis and you can produce small gametes and you have an XY chromosome. That's what makes you a man, as we would think of in the social sense, in the social context. And if you have large gametes, a vagina, and you have XX chromosomes, that necessarily makes you a woman. I'm not sure that that really makes the most sense either. Obviously, there's a lot of social interactions where we can imagine that this wouldn't really make the most sense, right? For instance, if I bring up the example of someone who presents as a woman and says that they're a woman, but ultimately I don't know. There's no way for me to know if that person's quote unquote actually a woman or not, because I just have to rely on their self identification. This is obviously useful. He says that's arbitrary, but I don't think it is. Similarly to how we might say that the category of Christian or Muslim is quote unquote arbitrary, but I don't think it is. We have to rely on self identification and what they are actually saying in that regard to get any truth from that interaction and to sort of rationally and sort of socially interact. I think that self-identification is a relatively valuable thing. And so that's kind of the entire point that I've tried to go off of in this debate. And I think that's something that ultimately BPF kind of conceded in this debate, was the idea that there's a lot of empirical justification for not necessarily blending this category, but probably trying to reject some of the rigidity or specificity of that definition. The idea that someone suffering from gender dysphoria is probably advantaged by having gender affirming healthcare, which is to say that you respect their pronouns and you try to give them the resources that they require so as to not feel ostracized and things like that. All the studies that we tend to look at in terms of trans healthcare and stuff like that tend to show that basically societies and familial relationships that don't ostracize trans people tend to result in those trans people feeling more accepted, less suicidal ideation, less depression. And to the extent that these empirical truths actually exist, obviously it makes sense that the specificity and the sort of usefulness of the categories of man and woman ought to be questioned insofar as they're causing unnecessary human suffering. Insofar as additionally, not even necessarily getting rid of those categories, which isn't necessarily what I'm advocating for in this debate, but sort of questioning the rigidity of those categories insofar as people who are born with an XY chromosome, born with a penis, who might want to identify as a woman, or people who are born with an XX chromosome, born with a vagina, might want to identify as a man. That's kind of the utility that I think you necessarily lose out on when you have such a specific or rigid definition, which Andrew, to be fair, doesn't even seem to actually have when he said that actually gender affirming healthcare is probably good in select circumstances, right? And so it seems like ultimately we agree, but we're having sort of this esoteric debate as to whether or not it's arbitrary. I already admit that it's arbitrary, but that doesn't mean it's not useful. And that's kind of what I hope I got across in the midst of this hour-long debate about trans people, trans rights, and trans ideology. To sum it up in one sentence, the world is made better with a less rigid definition of man and woman, and it is made better insofar as we respect trans people, especially those who are suffering from gender dysphoria and similarly sort of gender-related mental illnesses.
All right. I don't see any serious questions. I see bio valve said that he had one, but I don't see one that's actually serious. So
That's fine. It can go over to the moderator too. I knew that dropping the stream and moving over to Odyssey was going to reduce the amount of people who normally watch the program, this kind of thing. I'm okay with that. I didn't want anybody's channel to get messed up because we had this type of conversation.
So
ask the non-serious questions, Tom.
Ask the non-serious. Okay, why is EconoBoi, or sorry, how did EconoBoi learn to be such a sophist?
Oh God, this is where my philosophy education really fucks me. I don't. What is a sophist? I'm gonna have to look it up real quick.
It's somebody who's
Um,
normally using like rhetoric and not giving like direct answers to something. It's like
Oh, I
sophistry.
see. Yeah, I don't. I guess in general, I feel like I answered the questions as directly as I could. These are complex issues. I think oftentimes when you give a complex answer to a question, you're accused of trying to avoid the question. But that's not the intent of any of the answers I gave in this in this debate. Yes or no questions are not as easily reduced in a lot of those cases. And To the extent that I gave a long, complex answer to your question, which of course was just a meme, I hope I'm not accused of avoiding it.
So can I engage with that, Tom?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So in my estimation, as long as a question is framed in a way that doesn't have any presuppositions and it's not loaded, then answering yes or no to it is fine. For instance, if you ask a question like, how long have you been gay? There's a presupposition there, and I think that garners lots of explanation. But if you ask a question like, is this white and is this black? I think yes or no is plenty appropriate to answer that question. And I think that is what sophistry is. When people ask direct questions that they know the other person knows the answer to, and they're not preloaded and they don't have presuppositions, and they still refuse to engage with it. And I think that that's what we saw a lot of tonight.
I mean, I think sometimes it takes more than that. Like if you ask, like, is this white or is this black, and it's actually green, then sometimes the person's going to give a much longer answer.
Then that would be loaded.
Well, I'm not sure we could accuse many of your questions as having no load to them. I suppose we could say, right? I mean, there was certainly.
I think a lot of them were not loaded.
Well, I think that, like, for instance, I could give an example, right? The idea of how do we distinguish between like a man and a woman, right? So this is an example of a question that could, in theory, just have a very short sort of one answer question. You might say small gametes and large gametes, but obviously I'm operating on a totally different framework for answering that question, so I have to give probably a longer answer. That doesn't mean I'm necessarily avoiding the question. It's just that it's more complex.
Well, what about something that's not preloaded, like this, for instance? Is somebody who is producing small gametes a male?
So I can't say yes or no to that. I would say not.
Right, it's right, but there's no presupposition and it's not loaded. So why can't you just say yes?
So because it's not necessarily the case. It's literally impossible under my worldview to answer yes or no. That's not sophistry.
Gametes are binary. They're binary. If you produce small gametes, you're always classified scientifically as a male. There's nothing else you're ever going to be classified as, ever.
Well, let's say we had a society and half of them had a tattoo and half of them didn't have a tattoo, right? That was just how we rolled. Half the babies got tattoos and half didn't. Would we say that there's some sort of objective truth? The sort of tattooed people are necessarily this way or that way. We could say that one have tattoos and one doesn't. But
right. So if I said, do these babies have tattoos and these don't, would you say not necessarily?
No, I would say some don't, some don't. If you ask me, is someone with a penis...
So if I said to you, this baby has a tattoo, this baby does not have a tattoo, or if I asked you, does this baby have a tattoo, would that be yes or no? Would you be able to answer yes to that?
Yeah, for sure. Like, for instance,
okay, great. So if you produce small gametes, are you a male?
No, that's fundamentally not the same question. For instance, if you
it's fundamentally the exact same question, really. Instance, I'm asking you to just affirm something that's true.
Well, let's say I was a doctor and we just someone just gave birth, right? And the doctor's holding up this baby and says, nurse EconoBoi, does this baby have a penis? Right? And let's say that this baby did have a penis. Well, obviously, simply yes or no. Yes, that baby doctor does in fact have a penis. Now, if you were to ask me the more complex question, is this baby a male because they have a penis, right? I would have to say not necessarily so, because I'm not necessarily linking someone's having of a penis or the production of small gametes with their identification as a male or a woman. You can see how the complexity in that answer isn't necessarily obfuscating. I'm actually giving you a more direct answer than you otherwise would get.
What if you're just asking for the biological definition?
Yeah, if we were doing like reproductive research,
so biologically, if you produce small gametes, are you a male?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I mean,
Great.
yeah. Just to add on to that, obviously, like throughout this debate, I've said that if we're engaging in some sort of a research or some sort of, just some sort of context where it is strictly necessary to differentiate between someone who has a penis and has a vagina, and we would label that in our data as man and woman. That's I don't think that's a totally unreasonable thing to do. I'm just arguing against the relatively specific quote unquote rigid social definition of what a man and a woman is.
Then why did you argue against my biological definition for like 25 minutes, dude?
I didn't. The entire debate, I
You
said that there
did.
are
I said,
useful.
is that a male? Is it a
No.
male? If you produce small gametes, are you male?
He
Not
was
man.
arguing
Are you
against your
male?
biological definition being used in social circumstances.
I get it, but I
Yeah,
asked him
that's probably
specifically if this equals you being male, not man, but male, which are two very different terms.
Well, you probably should have delineated the difference for me, because obviously I'm going to assume you're using them in the same context. But yeah, if you were to ask me, and you did ask me directly, if you asked me directly, is it sometimes scientifically useful to distinguish between people with penises and vaginas, people that produce small and large gametes, people with X, Y, and XX chromosomes? Obviously, the answer to that is yes. I never said anything different. In my opening statement, I even recognized that can be useful.
Just not so insofar as if I identify myself as not producing small gametes, then that's fine. I'm no longer male.
No, a person with a penis probably can't reasonably identify as a person without a penis. You either have a penis or you don't. What I'm talking about is the social category of man and woman.
So now if you have a penis, you can't get rid of it, so you're a male, right?
No, again, the social category. I mean, how many, Andrew? You understand what I'm saying, right? Like, again, the social category of male is different.
You
I'm
just said you can't
that.
get rid of the penis. You understand the penis is objective, and you understand that makes you a male.
Okay, okay. When you say male,
you're just biologically, you're a male.
Okay, so again, if you're defining a male as someone with a penis, that's your strict definition. Obviously, everyone with a penis would be a male. I am questioning, however, the social application of that definition, right?
Gotcha.
Again, socially, someone who's a man or a woman is different.
So then when I say to you that adult human male is the definition of man, why would it not then logically follow that if I ask you if this person is a male or not, that you say yes or no?
Well, because you'd never made that distinction clear. Now
I made it 100 times. Like, I don't know how else I could have possibly made it.
Repeating yourself doesn't mean that you're making yourself more clear, right? I'm just saying that, again, I don't think trans people are under some sort of delusion that if they have a penis, they can identify as a woman and all of a sudden not have a penis, right? Obviously, that's part of the source of the mental anguish in the first place, right?
Then they're not
that's
real.
All that I would
then
say.
They're not real women.
No, I'm not saying that at all, right? I'm saying that woman is a social category. It's not necessarily reliant on having a vagina or not. Whereas you seem to be making that necessary connection. I'm just saying that connection is not necessary.
Didn't make the connection that it's having a vagina. What did I actually say a woman was?
Oh my God, Andrew!
What criteria?
Okay, I understand that esoterically you can say that.
It's not esoteric.
I'm not saying. Well, don't interrupt me, please. So I understand that you can say, okay, in fact, I didn't say vagina. I said large gamete production and or having an XX chromosome, right? I understand that.
Well, you cannot have a vagina and have and produce large gametes, right?
I understand. You're right. You're being more specific than I am.
Yes, I sure am being more specific.
Now, the point is just to say, though, that I think that I'm just using that as a shorthand, obviously. But in general, though, I think that there's not a necessary connection between the social sort of application of a man and a woman to what their chromosomal makeup is or what their gamete production is. That's what I'm calling into question here. Even you recognize that sometimes it is useful to break down that connection.
The only time that I said that it's useful is in a specific instance where somebody's delineation from reality is such that they're mentally fucking ill. The same way that I would maybe say that you could affirm somebody saying that there's a unicorn right in front of them so they didn't shoot themselves in the face wouldn't mean that there was actually a unicorn in front of them. You understand the difference, right?
I understand the difference that you're trying to communicate, but I think it kind of falls hollow. I think that in general, when we're talking about a social,
How
it's
does
not
it fall
necessarily a.
hollow? It's the same shit. I'm saying it's not real, but in this specific case where the person's so delusional that they think it is, and it might prevent them from killing themselves while you're treating them, that in
The
that
the
specific case, it's okay for you to
but
affirm this
again,
one thing.
it's relatively different though, because the existence of a unicorn is not a it's not a social construction, right? However,
A
the
unicorn's a
category
social construction, literally. There's
okay,
nothing
but
else it could be. It doesn't exist in objective
the
reality. It's a complete
the
social fucking construction.
the existence of a unicorn is not a social construction, right? We know
The
unicorns
existence of a
don't exist,
male is
right?
not a social construction.
And I would say that it is. That's where we disagree. Look at that.
So I think EconoBoi saying that the way that we categorize it would be socially constructed. So like we can say, hey, I have this word male. What am I going to apply it to? And then I can go find a way to apply that word to a category.
Let's give you that, Tom. Fair enough, right? But can't you categorize things in a way that's not true?
It is possible, yes.
Yes, it is possible. So if I say to you that you're categorizing something in a way that's untrue and you still want to categorize it that way, why is it not okay for me to dismiss the category as being untrue?
So you are categorizing yours based on utility, though, because gametes will give you more utility than chromosomes or
I'm
private
categorizing
parts.
it based on things that exist in objective reality, regardless of human thought.
So do chromosomes and private parts, though. That's what I said.
No, they
instead
exist
of chromosomes and private parts.
they exist in reality, regardless of human consciousness.
That's what I'm saying.
That's correct.
Yes, and so I'm saying you're choosing to define this based on gametes instead of chromosomes or private
based on
parts.
Things that are true.
Again, you're not hearing what I'm saying. You're choosing to use
Just
that
give up,
definition
Tom. Give up.
based on gametes.
Truth.
Oh my goodness. Based on gametes instead of chromosomes or private parts. All three of these
not
things.
Not instead of. I said all three of these are criteria that you can use for the exact same thing. It's not an instead of. So it's not a, oh, you have to have XY chromosomes or you're not male. That's absurd. There's three different categories for how you can identify what's male and what's female. The thing is that you guys like to pivot between them and say, well, you're saying that that all these three things, that all three of those things exist in objective reality, regardless of what you think consciously about it. That's my whole point. Unicorns do not.
Well, but that's kind of almost the point in and of itself, right? Unicorns don't exist in reality, right? But at the same time, you would say that there might be a utility to recognizing that they do exist if someone's about to shoot themselves in the face. Now, I would say that
I've explained.
Well, hold on, Andrew. Let me just finish my point here. So, the point is just to say that you would recognize there's a utility, perhaps in broadening that rigidity to a certain extent, right? Now, I would say that there is a difference between recognizing that unicorns are real for the purposes of saving someone who's about to kill themselves because they think unicorns are real, or some crazy example like that, and saying that the social category of woman, which again apparently to some extent we agree is a social category, can apply to people.
No extent. There's no extent.
Well,
we've never been able to come up with a single criteria.
You said gender is a social construction. Did I hear that wrong?
Female, not woman. Female.
Well,
learn the difference between female and woman.
So
you consider woman to be in contention. Right. You consider woman to be in contention. I consider woman to be adult human female. So it's not in contention for me.
Okay, but Andrew, this is I don't know how to explain this I think you're either being purposefully dense or
I don't think I am. So what I'm saying to you is this. Do unicorns exist?
I don't think unicorns exist, no.
Right. Okay. So if I told you unicorns exist and I saw one yesterday, would I be lying?
It's hard to say. I would say that you probably did not see a unicorn yesterday.
You probably did not. Why? Because they don't exist, right?
No, maybe you saw something that you thought was a unicorn, but
sure,
it probably wasn't.
But you don't believe me because they don't exist, right?
No, I would say you did not. You probably did not see a unicorn.
You just don't. Why? Because you don't believe that they exist, right?
There's presently no evidence that unicorns exist.
I feel the same way about gender.
Okay, well, I'm not sure how you could necessarily feel that way, considering trans people
exist, because trans people, what you call trans people, are just males that fucking pretend. That's it. They don't exist.
Well, or women,
there's
I guess,
no
right?
there's no actual delineation. It'd be like me putting a fucking horn on my head and saying I'm a unicorn. What makes me a unicorn? Nothing, right?
Well, I mean, you could do that if you'd want. I think it'd be pretty funny, but
Well,
I
what
think
would
again
make me
that's
the unicorn? You wouldn't believe me, right? You wouldn't believe I was a unicorn. You'd say unicorns don't exist, right?
So okay, so I have to. I'm sorry. As the linguist here, I would have to say, like, this is going to be based on your definition. If you define unicorn in a way to where you would qualify as a unicorn, then you would be correct in saying that you are
Well,
a
sure,
unicorn.
but you can define anything as anything. You can say a plane is a pencil and define all planes as being pencils. That's true. However, saying that the airplane itself is an automobile is false.
Based on the way that we
well,
define them, yes.
Yes, this is my contention.
Mhm.
well, if your contention is I define a male and female in such a way that basically that it is objective and not arbitrary, then that's
No, that it's
reasonable enough.
false.
I'm just
That it's false.
saying, all that I'm saying is that I think that my sort of more almost sociological understanding of gender and sex is probably more useful and probably leads to less suffering.
Right, your utilitarian view. It's always about less suffering. Doesn't matter what the truth is.
Well, with regard to social constructions, well, give me 1 second, Tom. With regard to social constructions, I'm not sure we can reasonably say that there is a absolute fact or truth of the matter.
Yes, we
say that
can.
something-
Otherwise, you wouldn't say unicorns don't exist, dumbass.
we can say that some things are
What
different
the fuck
than
are you
others,
talking about?
right?
You
Hold
just
on,
say we
Andrew,
can't make up
Andrew,
the
no, no, no.
truth.
Andrew, we can say that some things are different than others, right? We can say that black skin is different than white skin, right?
Yeah.
However, the distinct category of black and white are socially constructed.
I agree, but you can't say in the same breath that you think that social constructions can never be completely dismissed if you say that a unicorn is a social construction, but you dismiss that it exists.
I mean, I think it absolutely can be, right? For instance, you would say I would say that religions are social constructions, right? However, you believe in God, right?
He was saying that it
Sure.
can't be dismissed just based on the fact that it's a social construction. Some social constructions can be dismissed.
But nobody's ever disputed that. Literally, nobody's disputed that this entire debate.
Wait, Tom, what was the clarification? I'm confused by the clarification you offered.
He said a minute ago that you were saying that that you can't just dismiss a social construction, and I'm saying you were saying that you can't dismiss it just based on the fact that it's a social construction. Some social constructs can be dismissed, others can't.
Right. Okay. So well, not that we're on the, because you're the moderator, obviously, but yeah, that is my kind of what my point was just to say that yeah, obviously there are differences. We can identify clear differences between certain people. It's not that all people are arbitrarily the same. If we ultimately reduce down to it, people are different based on certain characteristics, right? It's just that the sociological sort of impacts or social constructions that we relate to those physical characteristics are arbitrary, and to the extent that the strict distinction between groups is useful, it should be used, but to the extent that it's arbitrary and might cause suffering in the case of
it's all arbitrary. Do
people with
unicorns have
dysphoria,
horns?
people with
unicorns
dysphoria,
have-
obviously we shouldn't use them.
Do
Yeah, go on,
unicorns have horns?
Based on our social construction of a unicorn, they do tend to have horns.
Well, what makes them a unicorn?
Well, again, based on our social construction of unicorns, having a horn and basically being a horse.
Well, why are they called unicorns?
Well, they've got the horn on their forehead. That's our
Right.
social construction.
So the thing is that the word, if you called them lobsters, right, would make less sense than unicorn. There's a reason that we have these identifiers for these social constructions so that they fucking make sense. We can at least identify what we're talking about. Unicorn makes sense. Unicorn, right? It makes fucking sense. What you're talking about makes no sense. These are arbitrary definitions that literally you can't define. You can't give me any criteria for any of them. It's fucking absurd. When I ask you what criteria would you give me for a unicorn, you'd say a single horn. It's like,
yeah,
when we get into that, that's why people think you're being a sophist.
I guess I disagree. I've explained it as best I can, though. Are there any other questions, Tom?
No, not that I can see. If there's, I don't.
Nobody's
They
I'm
again,
surprised. I thought
they're
this would
all
be a
the same.
polarizing topic.
Like
If we
you
were
know,
on like YouTube and Twitch and everything at the same time, EconoBoi, we would have a huge audience here
Yeah.
to get involved. But I dropped it over to Odyssey for the TOS purposes, so we don't have as large of an audience for this round.
What? Yeah, go on. Sorry.
the only other one that, like, let's see. Oh wait, this is a good one. Can either person explain how gender is separate from sex when gender roles among humans have gone generally unchanged since the dawn of record history?
Yeah, sure. I mean, all that I would say to that to start is just to say that there have been many sort of basic human traditions that we've called into question over time, and I'm not sure it's necessarily the case that because we have a sort of social hierarchy or social outcome that it ought to necessarily be that way forever. Um, so yeah, I just it seems like in a sort of almost traditional essentialist type argument that doesn't really make a lot of sense if we think of many other examples.
The reason he can't answer that is because he would be right back to square one.
I feel like I answered.
Where I would simply ask him to name which of those gender roles are unique to a man or unique to a woman, and he wouldn't be able to fucking answer me. He wouldn't be able to give me a single fucking criteria for which one was unique to which. And this is why this whole argument falls the fuck apart in seconds.
It's not really a response to the question, though. Obviously, the question was the idea that we've had these gender roles for basically all of human history, right?
Yeah. So what are they?
Why? Well, let me explain. So we've had these gender roles for all.
What are they that are unique to one or the other?
Like in terms of how historically we've defined gender roles?
No, as in what's unique to these gender roles that are unique
Andrew,
to a man or unique to a woman as far as the delineation goes.
Andrew, I understand that's the line of questioning you want to go down. My point was that wasn't the question that was asked, right? The question that was asked was,
but that's what it's reduced
gender
to.
roles
That's what
for all of history. And so we should continue those gender roles necessarily in the future. That's what I'm calling into question here. Not
right.
Not
well, that question has
themselves.
A presupposition, and what I'm doing is reducing it. I'm just reducing it down to its minimum. And so the reductio for this is, can you name a unique gender role? And what I postulate is that you cannot.
All right, I guess so.
Okay. Yeah, that's about it. Yeah, that's it. You have anything else, Andrew?
Well, I'd like to thank both EconoBoi for coming on tonight. I appreciate that, EconoBoi. And I'd like to thank Tom Foolery for taking the time to moderate the debate. Whether or not he wants to upload it to his channel is his fucking business. But I do want to thank both participants for coming into the Crucible tonight. There's only so many more debates that myself or Paige will be able to do because we're so inundated with requests now that we actually had to bring in a third moderator just to take care of the amount of debates that we're going to be running. So I do appreciate going head to head with you again, EconoBoi. Thank you so much for tonight for your time and Tom as well.
Alrighty, sounds good. It was fun debating, and to the very friendly Crucible audience, if you want to learn a goddamn thing or two about economics for once in your lives, obviously you can always subscribe to my channel and just go from there, guys. It'll be a good time learning about economics over on the EconoBoi YouTube channel. You can also harass me in the comments. You want to talk some shit in my comments? Go for it. All it does is feed the algorithm, my friends. You are only helping me by doing so. And never forget, no matter how much shit you talk, I will always love you. Okay?
EconoBoi, is your thing that's yours, right? That's not from StreamYard. That whole, like, when you talk
the spectralizer. Yeah, it's the audio waveform. Basically, my
like
my audience
OBS projection or
yeah, it's an OBS add-in, and I'm just using the virtual camera to project it into this StreamYards here. Basically, my audience was, and you can use it for like all sorts of visualizations, not just if you're a logo, but yeah, my audience was basically saying that the plain logo was a little not very stimulating, I guess, to the eye. So adding a little flair helped a lot.
Yep. I like it. That's really cool. All right. Well, that's it. EconoBoi, if you'll stick around for a second after we go off, but I don't have anything else.
All
All
right,
right.
guys, I'm going to end the broadcast. Thank you all so much for showing up to the Crucible tonight. It's been a long day, had a long AMA, followed by a spirited debate with EconoBoi. We always enjoy having him here. Please like and subscribe to his channel, even if you hate his fucking guts. The Crucible is a community of debaters, and we should appreciate the debaters who come on to the Crucible.